Witam Was na dzisiejszej konferencji.
I wish to welcome you most sincerely this conference today, organized on the day to commemorate the victims of concentration and death camps. On the 14th of June, 1940, Germans sent to Auschwitz from a prison in Tarnów a group of more than 700 Poles, including soldiers of the September campaign and members of underground organizations, secondary pupils and students, and a small group of Polish Jews. They got numbers from 31 to 750. 8 of these 325 people survived, and in the case of 111 people, their fate is unknown. The conference today accompanies the commemoration of the 82nd anniversary of this event, and this is covered by the honorary patronage of the President of the Republic of Poland, Mr. Andrzej Duda. Today we are in our thoughts with all citizens of the Republic of Poland whose life was marked with Auschwitz and other concentration camps and death camps. Back in June 1940, Poles were deported from other prisons, and transports continued until the end of the functioning of the camp. Initially, prisoners were men, but over time, Germans set up a camp for women with several dozens of prisoners, female prisoners, including children as well. Several 100,000 of Polish Jews were deported, who were murdered in Auschwitz in the name of the mad racial ideology, and that included Polish Roma people who were equally brutally treated. I may not fail to mention other groups of victims from Poland, children, women, people from Germanized region of Zamość, and those from Warsaw Uprising. And when I mention these groups of prisoners, in my eyes, in my soul, I see specific figures of those whom I used to know and had the privilege to know. I remember a prisoner from the first transport, Kazimierz Albin, who after his escape from Auschwitz fought in special divisions. I see another prisoner, Kazimierz Piechowski, who was talking about his escape in an SS man vehicle, and who was describing also the persecutions after the war. And I remember his reflections that since he escaped from Auschwitz, I was escaping all my life. I can see Halina Birnbaum, who, after Auschwitz, having lost her mother and her closest people, she kept saying that there is something to talk about, to think about, and someone to love. I go back to my meetings with Isabella Rubinstein, who told us how she learned French and how she was imagining this first day after liberation, when she would finally be able to take revenge. And then after years, she was laughing at herself, saying that it would not do anything really. And in my memory, I have meetings with Zofia Posmysz, who in every man in every single assessment, she was looking for traits of whatever was good. And I have in my memory a member of the International Council of Oświęcim, solidarity activist Henryk Wujec, who also concentrated on preserving the memory of the fate of his family members from the region of Zamość. And at the end, I would like to refer to this group, which is most numerous, of former inmates, children of the Warsaw during the time of uprising. Elżbieta Sobczyńska, who was 12 when she got to Auschwitz, and who lost her mother in the camp, and then years later she was determined to preserve their memory, and she continues to preserve the memory of the place and the fate of the little ones there. We also remember the biographies and the representatives of one group of victims, forest workers. There was something like 205 forest workers. 170 at least of these perished here and in other camps. There is a book to commemorate them, and the book is basis for the exhibition which is presented now in the building of the International Center for Education. The organizers of the conference today is the International Center for Education about Auschwitz and Holocaust, Association of Foresters and the State Forest Administration. I wish to thank you very much for this initiative and for the fact that together with our partners and together with you that we can have this conference. And in conclude, I would like to address the words of thanks, because we'll not have another chance for that. I'd like to address these words of thanks to my colleagues from the Center of Education, the State Museum, who have been preparing this conference, have been organizing it. And it's thanks to them that the conference is taking this particular shape. I wish you successful conference. I wish successful conference to ourselves, all of us, and let us proceed to the next item of the agenda.
Bardzo dziękuję panu dyrektorowi.
Thank you very much, Director Andrzej Kaczorek, for the official opening of today's conference. Now let me invite you to listen to a lecture by Piotr Setkiewicz, who will tell us about the first transports of Polish people to KL Auschwitz.
Witam Państwa serdecznie.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Przygotowałem tutaj prezentację.
I have prepared a presentation here,
Mam nadzieję, pomoże Państwu
which will help you to
w zrozumieniu
understand better the phenomenon
Auschwitz jako
of Auschwitz as a concentration camp on the one hand, and also as a camp of mass murder on the other hand. Some factions are forgotten sometimes, so sometimes we forget about Auschwitz as a concentration camp.
tej części historii obozu Auschwitz
In this part of the history
tylko i
of the camp, when it was just a concentration camp,
znaczącą rolę, główną rolę
a major role
organizacji obozu
in the organization of the camp
wygrali też
was played by
polscy więźniowie polityczni.
Polish political prisoners,
Do tego obozu przybyli jako pierwsi, którzy obóz właściwie zbudowali.
whom were first in this camp, and they built this camp. So they transformed the military place of the Polish army into they converted this military place into the largest concentration camp in the Third Reich. I will just mention briefly some themes, and let me also emphasize the presence of the Polish prisoners not only in this first period of the existence of the camp, but also later. There are myths, a number of myths about that, and I want to discuss them with you now. We can see some photos here which illustrate Polish prisoners brought to Auschwitz.
Widząc na naszej jeszcze starej wystawie głównej
In our old exhibition, main exhibition, there were registration photos made by SS in the camp. So when we look at those photos, we cannot imagine that those who came to the camp before the war had led ordinary lives. They experienced some joys, they had some worries and concerns. Look at the faces of those people, and in a moment you will see what they looked like in the concentration camp community when they were wearing just uniforms, when their heads had been shaven. Some statistics before that. I said that the Polish constituted the prevailing ethnic, prevailing nation in the first period of the existence of the concentration camp, from June 1940 until spring or April, May 1942. So as you can see, at that time, the camp was a relatively small one, judging by the standards of the Third Reich, compared to what happened later. Nonetheless, even if we assume that the majority of prisoners who came to Auschwitz later, who were registered here, were Jews, mainly Jews deported to Western Europe and Southern Europe, you should remember that still transports with Polish people came to Auschwitz. It's not that only until 1942 Poles were sent to the camp, and later just Jews were deported to the camp. For the whole, throughout the period when the camp existed until the autumn of 1944, Polish transports came here from different parts of Poland, from all districts of the general governorship, from other parts, from Wielkopolska, from Pomerania, not only from southern Poland. You can see the dynamics of those transports. Until spring of 1942, transports had been numerous, but more transports of Poles were brought, especially in 1942 and 43, which would indicate that with time the Nazi authorities developed and implemented a schedule of systematic emptying of prisons of the occupied country and bringing Poles to Auschwitz. Similarly is with females, Polish women brought to Auschwitz. In case of both men and women, beginning with 1944, the number of transports began to drop down. It was related to the order given by Heinrich Himmler, who wanted to reduce the number of Polish prisoners in Auschwitz. And from that point, in 1944, Poles
na terenie okupowanego kraju mieli być przywozeni.
from prisons throughout Poland were brought mainly to Grozan.
Ponadto
It didn't happen ultimately. In August and September of 1944, there were numerous transports from Warsaw during and after the Warsaw Uprising. So when we speak about Poles in Auschwitz, we cannot forget about Polish Jews.
szacuje się, że
So if we estimate that about 140,000 Polish men and women were brought to Auschwitz, we need to remember that about 300,000 of Polish Jews were brought to Auschwitz.
które uważały się za Polaków.
So they were considered Poles. They spoke Polish in their homes.
U których naziści odkryli
And Nazis discovered some Jewish predecessors in their roots. So in accordance with the law binding in Germany at that time, qualified them to put them into ghettos and later to send them to extermination camps. Most of Polish Jews came not to Auschwitz, but in Bełżec, Sobibor and Treblinka. There are statistics saying about the transport which came to Lublin district until the end of 1940. To 1,000,000 of Polish Jews were sent to the Lublin district.
wielu polskich Żydów.
So many Polish Jews came to Auschwitz, mainly initially from the area of Dąbrowskie district,
Potem również także
and later
rejonu Białegostoku,
from Białystok, Ciechanów, areas and other places in the occupied Poland. So this was the dynamics of transport of Polish Jews. As you can see, only some of them, a small number of them were registered in the camp. Most of them were exterminated when they came to Auschwitz and they were selected, or they were killed as a result of selection. So this was an introduction, but probably you would like to learn
idea
why the idea of building the Auschwitz concentration camp, and whether it's true that it was intended to kill Polish prisoners. Based on archives, we can prove that. First of all, we know that already at the end of 1939, due to overcrowding of prisons in the Upper Silesia mainly, Germans
zaczęli zastanawiać się nad
started to think
rozwiązaniem owego problemu.
about how to solve the problem, because at that time
Obóz w Dachau został
the camp in Dachau was temporarily shut down,
przez kilka miesięcy
closed. It was used
treningowe dla
as a training center for Waffen-SS troops.
również w innych obozach
Also in other camps, in Sachsenhausen or Buchenwald,
brakować miejsca.
there was no more places. The first cases of infectious diseases appeared, like typhus.
Przez pewien czas w końcu
So for some time at the end of 1939,
deportowanie Polaków
deportation of Poles who were arrested massively by the German police based on prescription lists
donosów ze strony
or denunciation from Volksdeutsch,
postanowiono
local Volksdeutsch.
obóz
So the decision was made to
takich Polaków właśnie,
build a camp to imprison temporarily Poles.
gdy
They were supposed to stay in that camp before the Poles are transported to other camps in Germany. So the scale of arrest was huge. So the camp was supposed to be large. So
wojska polskiego, które znajdowały się na
Somebody looked at the military
wówczas jeszcze znajdujący się w gestii Wehrmachtu.
camp, which was controlled by the German army, by Wehrmacht, and it was in the suburbs of Oświęcim. As a result of talks held in November and early December 1939, some initial agreements were made. The Wehrmacht gave its consent to lease the Polish military places in favor of SS, and SS would set up a temporary camp in Auschwitz, like quarantine camp as it was called, for 10,000 Polish prisoners.
Było jasne od początku, że
So it was clear from the very beginning that it was about political prisoners,
właśnie byłych powstańców, działaczy
former participants of uprising, those were regarded in the Upper Silesia as dangerous by Germans. So this was the document which states, which formulates this idea. It was written in late autumn 1939.
ten oto człowiek,
This person, Richard Glücks, who was an inspector of concentration camps, came to the conclusion that not only the Upper Silesia, but also in other areas annexed by the Third Reich, there was the same problem. So prisons were overcrowded. So he proposed to create a large camp where Poles would be kept temporarily. At the beginning of 1940, negotiations started. As you can see, this document comes from February 1940.
pojawił się już lager Auschwitz,
Lager Auschwitz appeared,
ale jak się wydaje nie było
but it seems that it was not
miejscem
a
traktowanym
place treated
docelowo jako takie, gdzie
as
ów
something where the main camp would be set up in the occupied Poland.
obóz ten nazywany jest
It was called
po prostu obozem, czyli
a camp.
miał być on traktowany jako obóz
So it was to
kwarantanny.
be treated as a quarantine camp.
Już po miesiącu
However, after 1 month,
władze hitlerowskie doszły przypuszczalnie do przekonania,
the Nazis came to the conclusion that
umiejscowienie takiego obozu kwarantanny dla
putting that
polskich więźniów politycznych poza
setting
systemem
up the camp outside the concentration camp would be troublesome for logistic and administrative reasons.
gdzieś pewnie w końcu marca
So at the end of March
1940 roku zapadła decyzja o
1940,
utworzeniu
a decision was made to create not any quarantine camp in the suburbs of Oświęcim, of Auschwitz, but a standard state
koncentracyjne
concentration camp.
w połowie kwietnia
In
doszło do
mid-April,
ostatecznej
the final agreement
terenu byłych polskich koszar i również tego
was signed with
budżetu i
this place, which was in the military barracks, and the SS issued
przekazanie
a consent to
2 milionów
to pay 2 million Deutschmarks to organize the camp. So still in April 1940, they were speaking about a camp, a concentration camp
około 10
for about 10,000 Polish
więźniów,
prisoners,
że generalnie mają być tutaj
So,
kierowani więźniowie
mainly political prisoners were to be sent here, and the criminal prisoners from this region, from the Upper Silesia, would be sent to camps in the Third Reich.
w drugiej połowie kwietnia do
At the end of April, that person came to Auschwitz.
zdjęcie z okresu przedwojennego, a
So the photo comes from on the left hand side from the before the war, and on the second, on the right hand during the war, Rudolf Hess, the first commander of this camp. He had a small amount, only 2 million Deutschmarks,
uważano, że
and
za te pieniądze uda się jedynie
they thought
wszystkie właściwie istniejące
that the existing
wykorzystać je na potrzeby
barracks would be somehow converted for the needs of the concentration camp.
Początkowo tak właśnie miał wyglądać obóz.
So this was the first idea
10 000 polskich,
of the camp for the first, for the 10,000 Polish political prisoners, not
dzisiaj tworzą
the bricklayed building, which now form the main part of the museum.
również jako
And during the war, it was Stammlager,
stały się jego zaczątkiem, ale też wszystkie inne
but all other barracks,
służyły jako stajnie, jako
which
magazyny,
were stables, warehouses of the Polish army before the war, and buildings across
wówczas Topolowej.
the street, which was called Topolowa Street at that time, and now it's called Leszczyńskiej Street.
To magazyny
So,
polskiego monopolu tytoniowego.
Also, tobacco had been stored before the war there.
Wymuszony pewnym
So this was the plan
właśnie środków finansowych.
because of scarce funds.
Nie starczało i pieniędzy, i
So money was sufficient only for this, for buying building materials and reconverting the former barracks into the camp. Rudolf Hess thought it was an unrealistic idea regarding
bardzo długiego ogrodzenia.
the necessity to build a fence.
Auschwitz bardzo licznego garnizonu SS.
Numerous SS garnison would have to be sent here and would have to build the fence. At that time,
Brakowało też i wartowników
there were no guards, not enough guards
obozów koncentracyjnych.
within the structures of the inspectorate of concentration camps.
Został zarzucony.
So this plan was given up, but
Było to,
it was obvious for Hess
podstawą
that
przyszłego
the
obozu
basis of the future concentration
20
camp would be the complex of 22
budynków
bricklayed buildings which were left over after the Polish military base. And you can see here
w drugiej połowie kwietnia 1940
in the second half of April 1940,
pierwszych prac budowlanych.
building work started in this place.
I teraz,
And now,
jeśli do tej pory,
If
czyli do
so far,
powiedzmy, połowy
until
maja 1940
mid-May 1940, somebody believed that
Auschwitz będą w
in
przyszłości
principle the prisoners here would be Poles or Silesian population from the Upper Silesia,
maja,
then in the second half of May,
nowe decyzje.
new decisions were made.
Widzimy,
As we can see in this document,
zwiększono nagle pojęcie
suddenly the capacity of the Auschwitz camp increased from 10,000 up to 30,000. It's a lot.
że w tym czasie
It means that at that time the plan was to create in Oświęcim the largest camp out of all concentration camps existing in the Third Reich. So
wojny we wszystkich
more prisoners were to be kept here than in all other German concentration camps altogether. So something happened that suddenly the plant capacity increased so much. And this fact, this
prawdopodobieństwa tak
was
zwana
probably
akcja
the AB action
przeciwko
addressed
wszystkim polskiej inteligencji.
against Polish intelligentsia.
Fakt
So using the fact
publicznej
of that the public opinion was absorbed in other
Francji
military
doszli do przekonania, że
activities in France. So the Nazis thought that it was a good moment to kill the Polish intelligentsia. Some of them were to be shot down, and about 20,000 of them were to be put into the concentration camp as ordered by Himmler. It's not a coincidence
w tym samym
that at the same time
tutaj planowaną pojemność
the planned capacity of Auschwitz camp was increased from 10,000 up to 30,000 prisoners.
ludzie
These were to be people who were to come here not only from the Upper Silesia region, but mainly from the general governorship.
I teraz tak, patrząc tutaj
When we look at the map
ziem polskich,
of the occupied Polish territory, the first transports which were brought to Auschwitz, paradoxically, were not sent from the general governorship,
skierowane ze Skórnego Śląska,
from the Upper Silesia, but from the southern area of the general governorship.
krakowskiego. Tym niemniej,
from Cracow district.
ale pierwszymi
The first
Auschwitz tak naprawdę
prisoners of Auschwitz were not Poles, but Germans.
pierwszych 30
The first 30 German prisoners, criminals,
skierowano do
were sent to Auschwitz on the 20th May 1940, and
nie wiemy, szczerze mówiąc, co
frankly speaking, we don't know what happened with them for over 3 weeks. Probably they spent,
w jakimś pomieszczeniu
they were closed here,
w budynku sztabowym
probably they were in the staff building across the street, across Topolowa Street, and they were doing nothing, probably. Why?
okazało się, że
It turned out that
wówczas
already then
Niemcy
Germans
zaczęli mieć pewne trudności z
started to have some difficulties with building materials.
pozyskaniem drutu kolczastego.
They couldn't buy barbed wire. Although Auschwitz was considered as prospectively the largest concentration camp,
Nie otrzymał on jeszcze jakichś tam priorytetów, jeśli
it was not a priority when it comes to supplies. So the camp was not ready, buildings were not fenced yet. So for the 3 weeks, those German couples, future couples,
spędzali
spent the time here without doing anything.
dopiero
Only
w tym samym czasie mniej więcej
at the same, more or less at the same time,
kierowaniem do Auschwitz więźniów i polskich i takim
Polish prisoners
więzieniem
were brought here. So the first prison, which was the place of deportation of Poles to Auschwitz, was the prison in Tarnów. These were mainly people who were arrested not only in Tarnów, but in many other neighboring towns.
co do powodów ich aresztowania
The reasons for the arrest,
możemy tutaj domniemywać jedynie
we can guess only based on their documents,
zostały wytworzone w kancelariach
which were created by
koncentracyjnych znacznie później.
in offices much later in different concentration camps.
Powód aresztowania
The reason for arrest here, it was usually
sformułowanie
written
więzień politycznych,
political prisoner.
więźniowie należący do jakichś innych
So
kategorii.
they
Co więcej,
didn't belong to any other categories.
które również się zachowały.
So there are other documents which were generated in other concentration camps.
Można zauważyć,
We
że
can see that the reason for arrest of those people
było podejrzenie o
was suspicion that they belonged to the resistance movement, and this was the fact. Some of them
członkowie
were
organizacji
members
niepodległościowych, które
of independence organizations which started to appear at that time in southern Poland,
głównie Orła Białego lub
mainly the White Eagle organization or circle of friends,
zbierali się ze sobą
people who gathered together.
i wymieniali między sobą
They exchanged information
sytuację na
about the situation in front.
zastanawiali się nad
They were wondering about some methods of
w działalności
running
skierowanej przeciwko Niemcom i tak dalej. Niestety
activities against Germans. Unfortunately, because they didn't have much experience, those groups were
wykrywane przez
easily discovered by Gestapo, and the members of those organizations were imprisoned. Among those Poles, there were also
bardzo młodzi,
very young people, high school students,
których to aresztowano z
who
względu
were arrested
obawiano się
because Germans were afraid.
właściwie przed 3 maja
So it was just before the 3rd May 1940. The Germans were afraid that those students would somehow commemorate the Polish national day of Constitution.
w dużej mierze
So, to a high extent,
Polacy
Poles who were arrested at that time were imprisoned in Tarnów only based on some suspicions,
w dużej mierze nie zdążyli oni
and
uczynić nic takiego
they didn't do anything that would be
III Rzeszy.
against the interests of the Third Reich.
Gwałtownie
So we can see here that more or less
w drugiej połowie maja
in mid-May,
i na początku
at the beginning of June,
maja głównie zaczęto takie transporty
transports were sent to the prison in Tarnów,
stało się
which
przepełnione. Tam
was overcrowded quite
ponadwukrotnie
soon.
więcej więźniów się znajdowało.
Twice as many prisoners were there than expected by the prison standards. Poles from Jarosław, Zakopane, Nowy Sącz, Sanok, Rzeszów were sent to that prison. Many towns, especially in eastern
Krakowskie.
Kraków district.
I ostatecznie 14 czerwca
Finally, on the 14th of June,
więzienia w Tarnowie pojawił się
book
taki
in
wpis.
the prison of
53
Tarnów
więźniów, którzy zostali
mentioned 753 inmates who were to be transported to Auschwitz. These people spent the night the 14th of June in the
w Tarnowie,
Jewish
potem dostali
ritual bath in Tarnów, and then they were taken to the railway station in Tarnów.
różnica
That
25
difference of 25 inmates between the number of those who were to be transported and the ones who actually reached Auschwitz. These were people who were withdrawn from that transport at the very last moment and turned back to the prison, maybe as a result of a mistake, or the Gestapo thought that they would be needed for further interrogations. So ultimately it was 728 prisoners who went to Auschwitz. We can see them marching through the streets of Tarnów.
I trasę
And the route of the march and the timetable of a special train, based on which, assuming that it left in accordance with the timetable, that the transport set off from Tarnów at 10:13 and reached Auschwitz at 3:10. So we would have the exact time when the first transport arrived in Auschwitz, the first transport of Polish political prisoners. They were recollecting that they had been really impressed by traveling across Cracow, where they had learned that the Germans had taken over Paris. They passed the railway station in Oświęcim. Two of them only who had come from Oświęcim could probably know more or less where they were. For most of them, the name did not mean anything. Prisoners from Tarnów who set off in that transport were initially sort of glad or in good mood, because they had expected that they hadn't done anything wrong. So perhaps the Germans were taking them to some sort of some work to be done, and that would be better compared to staying in the small cells of the prison of Tarnów. So they arrived at the railway siding next to the building of the tobacco factory, Stabsgebäude, that is the staff building where they were finally placed. And then when you read recollections of former inmates, you would see that they were saying that when they were received at that ramp, that was really brutal. They were immediately beaten up by German capos, SS men, and rushed to the staff building. And as you can see on that plan, that was completely unnecessary, because it was just a dozen or so meters, or several tens of meters. So the point was not to accelerate the whole procedure, but just to terrorize the Poles there.
Pokazanie im w jakim miejscu się znaleźli.
to show them where they actually were. And this is a photograph taken during the war. The building to the left in the masking colors, Stabsgebäude, and opposite the
I teraz tak,
tobacco
chciałem zwrócić Państwa uwagę na
building, SS
cechy
house. And let me mention some characteristics of the prisoners in that transport. Very many of them were young people.
Grupę starszych więźniów to albo to są jacyś nauczyciele,
The
czy też
older ones were either teachers or lawyers. Jews of Tarnów who arrived in a transport together with Poles. Mostly these were secondary school pupils, students, or young people who were included in the category of so-called tourists, meaning that
młodzi mężczyźni, którzy
these were young men who
obowiązkiem jest kontynuowanie
concluded that it was their obligation to continue fighting against Germans, and they were trying to somehow get through the borders with Slovakia or Hungary. Unfortunately, they were arrested and sent to prisons along the border and then to Tarnów. This can be seen clearly by the places where they had been born. Many of them lived in Warsaw, in Łódź, or in other cities. And when we think why so many people from Warsaw on the Polish-Slovak border, we conclude that the only reason was that they were attempting to cross the border and reach Sikorski's army in France. And if we look at the professions and occupations of these people, nearly half of them were pupils or students, very young people. Amongst them, we've got prisoner number 31. As I mentioned, the first 30 prisoners formally registered in Auschwitz were German criminals, future capos, and block officers. And the first political prisoner,
o którym dziś mówimy,
one we are talking about now is Stanisław Ryniak, prisoner number 31. If you look at the faces of these people, just picked at random by myself, we can see that these are really very, very young people.
a to zdjęcia
These are photographs done, taken before the war.
w pierwszym transporcie, co do których
Prisoners brought in the first transport,
nie zachowały się.
and the registration photographs have not been preserved.
I zostali oni umieszczeni
And they were placed in this building.
późniejsze
And this is a later photograph of spring 1941.
Niemniej zapewne
Nonetheless, the square before Stabsgebäude looked in a similar way, maybe the same fence as well.
powitał
Prisoners were welcomed by this officer standing here, Lagerführer Karl Frisch, who was deputy commander of the
wygłosił takie przemówienie,
camp, and he made a speech to say that Jews
2 tygodnie księże
could
katoliccy
stay there for
co dla wielu
2 weeks, priests for a month, and then others for 2 months, and that really proved to be true for many. And this is one of SS men
gorliwie zajmował
who was very eager to
prowadzeniem tak zwanego sportu, ćwiczeń
do
fizycznych,
so-called sports,
kolejnych transportów
really hard exercises
przebywali
to
oni
introduce prisoners into the rigor. They were staying
rozumieniem tego
within so-called quarantine, which had
Sensem kwarantannym tak naprawdę
nothing to do with the common meaning of the term. The point was not to isolate those with any contagious diseases, but to break their spirits and to make them
natychmiastowego reagowania na
get used to respond immediately to any orders, however brutal they were. So the prisoners had to
przesiady,
continue all sorts of exercises, which we can see here in these drawings, and that continued for hours and hours. And that was a torture for older prisoners who fell on the ground, being exhausted, and they were then beaten up by the couples with sticks. And as former inmates recollected, several days later there were cases of death. Either they were beaten to death or they died in the temporary makeshift chamber of the sick. And then there was another transport from the district of Cracow. On the 20th of June, more than 300 prisoners from the prison of Nowy Wiśnicz, and then there were transports from Cracow coming and from Upper Silesia as well.
powoli obóz się zapełniał i więźniów
So the camp was being filled up, and prisoners were moved to brick buildings, and they were hired to do all sorts of construction work, leveling the ground, building additional levels of buildings which used to consist of one story only. There are only a few photographs preserved. From mid-1941 we can see the construction of a fence, and this is what the camp looked in mid-1941. As you can see, this is an aerial photograph by Luftwaffe at the time, and it more or less looked rather similar. This confirms what I've said, that Auschwitz camp did not mean any particular priority in terms of financing or supplies of construction materials. So the camp was relatively small. Prisoners were working intensively, doing work which could have been done more effectively using the simplest tools. So if prisoners were sent to carry bricks from carriages to the construction site, then they had to do it in such a way that every one of them got 5 bricks, and they had to run to bring the bricks to the destination, which was absurd in terms of work efficiency, because perhaps it would have been easier to have some sort of carriages to take them there. But at that time, they did not really think about the effort to be put by prisoners to do this work. So SS men made a point for prisoners to be occupied all the time, to keep working, because as you can note over the gate to the camp, one of the main tasks of the camp was to educate them through labor. So work was to make them free, so they kept busy, and these were guarded by these people. Apart from the SS men who were supervising the work, these German functional officers were responsible for maintaining the pace of work, hitting and beating prisoners and killing them on there themselves through the conditions created there.
wydzielonych pomieszczeniach.
They were staying in some separate spaces, they had separate beds. Generally,
Wiele do stracenia,
they had quite a lot to lose if they didn't want to do what the SS men had been telling them, so they were trying to satisfy the superiors. And these are pictures from the initial periods of the existence of the Auschwitz camp. All sorts of insects, fleas and lice, all sorts of diseases developed, and there were prisoners killed by them being pressed to the ground. Those who tried to escape, they were places, public places in front of the gate. The bodies of those who died were transported to the crematorium, and just some paintings to show the day, the waking up, meals, washing.
W początkowym okresie istnienia Auschwitz instalacji wodociągowej
No water supply systems, so prisoners were washing, taking sort of baths in front of the buildings. Then they marching to work, and then with hardly any use of even the simplest tools, which could have made this work easier.
Powrót z pracy zazwyczaj
And then return from work,
niesieniem tych więźniów
and that meant that those who either died or were not strong enough to walk, they had to be carried.
niewolne, w czasie wolnym
In a free time was singing lessons, lessons to sing and learn German songs, and they didn't know German, so they didn't know how to sing, and they pretended they were singing, and if that was spotted, they were beaten up again. Hunger was becoming more prevailing, and as a result, even young prisoners were really becoming weaker and weaker. Nonetheless, until the autumn of 1940, the death rate was relatively low in Auschwitz, and then later, August and September, more numerous transports were coming from the prison of Pięciak, and you can see that initially from the district of Cracow or Upper Silesia, it was something like more than 2,000 prisoners, and then more than 3,000 political prisoners from Warsaw, and that was the limit of the camp's capacity. 6,000 prisoners in Auschwitz, and they couldn't place more, also because there were no two-level beds. All of them were sleeping on the floor, tightly one next to another. So these are scenes from the end of the year, Christmas Eve of 1940, when more and more prisoners who died then were placed on in the square to delete them from the records, for the bodies to be taken to the crematoria, and the death rate was increasing considerably, especially at the beginning of 1941. And then, if we look at this median death rates, for lack of other documents, we can determine that based on the number of registration photographs, with some adjustments of some other factors, some being destroyed. But we can see a prevailing tendency. Prisoners who came to Auschwitz as first, until spring of 1941 stood a higher chance to save their lives. This was because some of them had got to better commandos working under the roof, as they were saying. As a result, they didn't have to spend the autumn working outside in the mud and rain and cold. A number of these good sort of positions in the good commandos was limited in the warehouses, in the camp, hospital, sanitary workers, so it was not really functions but positions in the so-called better commandos. But generally this survival rate was different, and this tendency prevailed, though, indicating that until the spring of 1941 amongst the Poles who had come as first, it was 1/3 who had perished, the ones who died in the winter and the early spring of 1941. Further plans to extend the camp, the places where the prisoners were working, and the camp workshops. And many of the prisoners wanted to get there, and it was impossible for most of them. And in 1941, there are more and more transports coming. To the left, you can see the categories: political Poles, and there were increasingly Polish Jews until the spring of 1942. Most prisoners were Poles. Why were prisoners brought to Auschwitz? There were similar reasons during the first period, in particular activity in all sorts of independence organizations fighting for independence. There were mainly members of the resistance movement. Time is nearly up. I would like just to mention some other aspect of these later transports. We imagine that it were mainly political prisoners brought to Auschwitz, those who were engaged or were members of the resistance movement and were active fighting against the Germans, or were preparing to some sort of actions. And then there is information that someone was arrested because they had carried weapons. Yes, that was the reason why they were sent to Auschwitz. Someone had been a member of a PPR organization. And again, here, many such entries, Polish political prisoner, which meant in practice that he had not been arrested because of a very specific reason, but was just caught up in the street. And then someone was put in prison because he had been a Polish soldier. Another one who had been fighting in the first Silesian uprising, 1919. Someone else, member of some actions against Poles. Someone was a member of the intelligentsia, and then as such, potentially they could be a member of the resistance movement. Destroyed an apartment which had been owned by a Volksdeutsch. Having been informed that he would be deported, then he must have damaged the furniture, and because the furniture was to become possessed by a Volksdeutsch, then sent to the camp. And then Aktion Warschau, during the uprising in Warsaw, it was said, someone said, Germans may not win this war. Someone informed on them. Someone else was singing the Polish national anthem. got drunk and he was screaming,
Nie chciał nosić litery P.
"Long live Poland." He didn't want to carry the letter P on his clothes. Relationships with a German girl. He kissed a German girl. He mistreated horses on some sort of a German horse. He had a quarrel with
Podbił się z bałą.
someone in a household. Bauer had contacted French or British prisoners of war or other Poles. So there were all sorts of reasons. So the last reflection is that if we look at the reasons why Poles were arrested and most of them had perished in Auschwitz, you would imagine perhaps that these were mainly members of the resistance movement. Not really, as you can see from these examples, half of the Poles who had got to Auschwitz were not arrested and sent to the camp because they had been involved in some sort of a resistance movement, but they fell victim to all sorts of terrorist actions. And then in conclusion,
Co z tego wynika? Więc jeśli na przykład Francuz,
for example, if a Frenchman during the Second World War
i słusznie pewnie
could, and rightly so, imagine that if they did not engage in any resistance activities, specific activities against the occupiers, they would highly likely survive and wait to see the end of the war. And that was a reality in France, while in the occupied Poland, someone might have tried to keep as far away from any activities against Germans as far as possible, and someone did not want to have anything to do with the resistance movement. They would end up in Auschwitz anyway and perishing here anyway. Thank you, that's all.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie doktorze.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for presenting the story of the Polish transports which were sent to the Auschwitz concentration camp. Now let me invite you to the participation in the discussion panel called Polish Foresters during the Second World War, Help and Cooperation with Polish Partisans. The moderator will be Teresa Wontor-Cichy, employed in the Center of Research on in the Museum of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the participants of this panel, Arkadiusz from the Home Army Museum in Cracow, Mr. Krzysztof Pięciak from the Institute of Polish National Remembrance from Cracow, and Piotr, Kacprzak, co-author of the book of Polish Foresters Deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Dobrze, mój mikrofon działa.
Mic is working.
Polscy leśnicy,
Polish foresters during the Second World War, help and collaboration with the partisans. This is the topic of our discussion. The participants of our panel discussion will be Mr. Piotr Kacprzak, Deputy Director for Forest Management, acting as the chair of Świętokrzyskie Radomskie branch of the Polish Forest Association, co-author of the Book of Remembrance of Polish Foresters. Welcome. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
dziękujemy za przyjęcie
Thank
zaproszenia.
you for accepting our invitation. Arkadiusz Bąk, a graduate of history and postgraduate studies at the Jagiellonian University of Krakow, working in the historic department of Home Army Museum
regionalista,
so
działacz społeczny,
social activist working in NGOs, archivist, author of popular scientific articles and co-author of books Zawierucha Wielkiej Wojny
i ślady Armii Krajowej w
and
Małopolsce,
Traces of Home Army in Małopolskie,
historyczno-krajowej.
historic and
Witamy serdecznie
Skype
i dziękujemy za przyjęcie
guiding book. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Naszym trzecim
Our third panelist
pan Krzysztof
is Mr. Krzysztof Pięciak, a historian, a graduate of the Faculty of History of Jagiellonian University.
zainteresowany,
He's interested in
koncentrują się wokół wojskowości,
military
działalności
topics,
polskiego
activities of the Polish
niepodległościowego,
independence underground in the Second World War
po jej zakończeniu.
and after the war.
Krzysztof pracuje w
Krzysztof
Krakowie
works
poszukiwań
in the Department of Identifications and Search in the Institute of National Remembrance in Cracow. Good morning.
Również bardzo dziękujemy za przyjęcie.
Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Naszą rozmowę
Our panel discussion will be started with the topics related to the outbreak of the Second World War. So my first question
pana Piotra Kacprzaka. Wybuch
is
II
to
wojny
Piotr
światowej,
Kacprzak.
niepodległości,
Outbreak of the Second World War, loss of independence, partition of Poland between two
dla gospodarki
occupants
poważne zmiany.
brought major changes in the Polish forestry. So what difficulties were faced by the Polish foresters after the failure of the beginning of the war in September 1939? To answer the last part of the question, we have to
muszę przedstawić sytuację, która
present a situation which started in August in 1939, which lasted until October 1939. Those months are really significant. Very rarely
zapomina się o dacie
we forget about the date 22nd of August 1939, Obersalzberg town.
wszystkich dowódców
So all commanders, German commanders and police and the security services meet with Hitler. And this is where Hitler presents the reasons for aggression, attack to Poland. And during that conference in Obersalzberg, Hitler presented it to the German army and the security services, how they should deal with the Polish
z podbitą ludnością
society. What
przedmówca mówili,
the previous speaker said, it was a consequence of certain policy which was introduced even earlier towards the eastern neighbor. On the 23rd of August, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was signed in Moscow, so on the very next day. So the 23rd of August also marks a general situation in relation to the potential division of Poland into two parts. And 28th of September 1939, so the military actions were still ongoing, but on that day details were made in Moscow of how to partition Poland. So they talk about Lithuania. During the interwar period, Polish-Lithuanian relations were different, were varied. And here German activities will overlap. So Poland was Germans and Russians divided Poland into two halves, more or less. In case of Germany, we need to remember two situations. Areas which were occupied by Germans, and they created the general governorship.
proszę Państwa, wracam znów do tego
And
nieszczęsnego Obersalzbergu.
Obersalzberg again.
Szacunki
So estimates
Proszę państwa, że wrzesień
were that in September, October,
zielony do rzeczy.
in areas
Polska pomoże
brought, annexed to Germany,
ginie ponad 40
over 40,000 civilians died. These were not, but it was not by accident. The previous speaker, Mr. Piotr Setkiewicz, mentioned the fifth column, as they say.
Tak, proszę państwa, oni przychodzili
So they came with ready-made lists
aresztować, a najlepiej
of people to be arrested or shot down immediately. Not to be kept in prisons, but to be shot down. So it was September, October. Who did it?
robi to Wehrmacht,
Sometimes it was done by Wehrmacht,
robi to Wehrmacht. Niemiecki,
not just security services,
a na części tej
but also policemen.
właśnie ta piąta
The fifth column
kolumna.
was responsible.
Tysiące
Thousands of people died.
naprawdę, tak jak tutaj też na końcu pan mówił, no nie wiadomo tak naprawdę dlatego, chyba tylko dlatego,
We don't know why.
prawdziwymi Polakami,
Because they were really true Poles, because they were patriots, that Poland was the most important thing. And within this group, not only in Upper Silesia, not only Wielkopolska, not only in Pomerania, but also in other parts of Poland, those people died, including foresters,
roku i w październiku
in September and October of 1939, only because they were Poles and they wanted independent Poland. On the 17th of September 1939, when the Russians came to Poland, occupied Poland and attacked Poland,
aniżeli ta na zachodzie.
a much worse situation occurred in the east, worse in its effects, because
Takie rzeczy jak,
what overlapped there was not only nationalisms,
proszę państwa, dochodzi nowy element
but there was a new element added,
komunistyczny,
communist elements.
o których my mało mówimy.
We don't
Właśnie to
say much about them. So communist elements were added. So when the Soviet army attacked Poland and KW,
z jednej strony piąta kolumna,
so we have on the fifth column in the west and the security services there, and in the east we had communists and NKVD. So
że generalnie
these were
ginęła cywilna.
this caused that civilians died.
Później pamiętamy, proszę państwa, te deportacje.
Then we remember deportations, February 1940, April, June 1940 in the east, and one more deportation June 1941. How many people were resettled? We don't know. There are different estimates.
Polskie, inne są
Polish are different Polish estimates. Russian statistics are different. This is a question to historians to analyze this.
jeżeli może do mnie. Natomiast fakt, proszę państwa, jest,
But the fact is
że tam się przepraszam
that
za słowa. Pan się nie patyczkował.
nobody cared.
Cały element
There
polski, który był
all Polish people in the eastern part of Poland
wyczyścić można
that was emptied so ethnically. So those areas were emptied ethnically.
mniejszość stanowiła,
And sometimes Polish people were in minority.
deportowano całe rodziny.
So whole families were deported, also foresters. Let's make it clear. In the article, which is a part of the book of Remembrance dedicated to foresters, you were writing about legal acts which had an impact on the Polish forests. You mentioned diversification during the partition, due to the partitions, parts occupied by Germans and the part of Poland occupied by and annexed to the Soviet Union.
Może jeszcze króciutko parę słów na ten temat.
briefly,
Jak bardzo to rzutowało na
tell us how much it impacted
administracji lasów.
the lives of administration of Polish forests. So the position of people changed. Those who were in the Reich became the citizens of the Third Reich. And they were sentenced. They were doomed to the German law. Those who were in the Soviet zone were doomed to the law imposed by Soviets. So the Soviet citizenship was imposed on them.
150,000 ludzi.
About 150,000 people were called up to the army.
To były formacje budowlane.
So these were building formations, military formations, just as here. Labor was emphasized here in Auschwitz. So in the East, labor was needed for other reasons. Foresters were considered anti-Soviet elements. So those group, this group, whatever was Polish had to be destroyed and was destroyed with awareness. The situation was completely different when general governorship was created. Taking into account those three regions, we can say that in general governorship, this situation was best out of the three situations. This was German administration, but those who lived here or were resettled from many parts of Poland to the general governorship, in many situations they survived the war. They had to subject themselves to the German forest law and general forest law. So this is briefly the book. I detail those laws.
Dziękuję bardzo. Oczywiście
which were binding at that time.
odsyłamy do
Thank you. And
historycy z
anyone who's
Muzeum
interested
Armii
might
Krajowej
get
w Krakowie
read
podejmują
the
szereg
article.
tematów badawczych,
Historians are undertaking a number of research
leśników.
themes about the fates of Polish forest workers, and this is a question to Arkadiusz Bąk about this work. Foresters, those who are engaged in forest management, had a lot to do and committed to the functioning of the Polish army in conspiracy. They got involved in that conspiracy activity indirectly by protecting forests, by restricting the scale of cutting trees, those species which were precious and valuable to our state, and also through restricting any activities which were to somehow limit the operation of the war industry, and foresters were directly involved in conspiracy activities. Without that involvement, that underground activity would have been more difficult. And that was in a number of dimensions. They were hiding, helping hide those who were running away or who were trying to get through the green border and escaped from the German or Soviet occupied areas or were within the area of the general government. They offered advice indicating paths which could be followed by partisans where they could escape in situations of threat. And many foresters had been involved in Home Army, and they were actively involved in partisan troops. And that activity was not by chance. Many of the foresters and forest workers came as veterans of the First World War, or those who had been fighting for Polish independence, 1918, 1921, having after the end of the war. They were
Wpływ na te działania
amongst those working for forest administrations.
organizacja nazywana
There was also an organization for military training of foresters established after 1933, and the point was to teach foresters to carry weapons and to get prepared for the war.
w szkoleniu takim wzięło udział
There are estimates that something like 12,000 of forest workers had been involved in that training. I've just provided this introduction
do pytania pani
with reference to the question that has been asked. The museum, the historical department of the Home Army Museum, has been carrying out two projects which link to this discussion panel. The first of these is an
żołnierzy Armii Krajowej.
internet database of
Zbiór biogramów skrupulatnie
soldiers,
przez
short biographies
prowadzony przez profesora Olgierda Grota.
done under the supervision of Professor Olgierd Grot with a subsidy from the Ministry of Education, Higher Education. And the database is continued to be developed, but it contains nearly 24,000 short biographies. There are a variety of criteria to peruse that, and anyone who is interested might get to it to look for Home Army soldiers who were fighting within the structures in a variety of areas and locations, who were members of the Home Army, but who were foresters as well, or who somehow worked within the forest administration. And another project I was involved in directly over the past several years. We developed and published 2 volumes of a guidebook, and this is the first volume. And quite recently the second volume has come out.
Pozwoliłem sobie właśnie pokazać też
And I've just shown you these publications because each of these volumes contains 12 routes following the traces of soldiers of the Home Army. And these routes are identified to make it easier for tourists and researchers following tourist routes and educational paths. And there are stops on these routes following a certain pattern. And I'm mentioning that because most of these stops somehow relate to forest administration and the activities of partisan troops who were supported by foresters and forest administration. And in the second volume, 3 routes lead through Beskid Sądecki mountain range. And the major owner of the land was Count Stadnicki, and he bought forests of Szczawnica and Stadnicki. I'm mentioning him because he had graduated from forest administration in the University of Munich and other studies in Vienna, and he owned 11,000 hectares of forests.
Już w czasie I wojny światowej
during the First World War, he already demonstrated his patriotic approaches. He was hiding those who wanted to avoid being sent to the Italian front as members of the Austrian army. He also introduced new species of trees in his forests. He set up a number of protected areas in a variety of locations within the forest that he owned. During the Second World War, the whole Stadnicki family got involved in conspiracy. The Count supported financially partisans, and the forest stations within Beskid Sądecki mountain range offered shelter to those who were trying to cross the border, who were escaping or were trying to escape the German security services. His daughters, sons-in-law, like Adam Czartoryski, worked at one of the establishments. His wife undertook some activities, and son Józef, even though he was disabled, he worked and managed one of the stations in Nawojowa. Daughters were not married, carried all sorts of messages. And the wife of the Count, Stefania, managed one of the establishments in the powiat of Szczawnica, in the region there, and there were different routes crossing there. And Nawojowa, the town of Nawojowa, was a place where the different routes crossed. And in both volumes we described the land of Limanova and the area of Limanova. We've got huge areas of forests, most of these being owned by Zofia Turska of Tymbark, and she from the autumn of 1939 organized certain establishments as contact points for conspiracy activities. And that's in the area of Mogielnica mountain range. There are other regions and areas which were engaged and performing very important roles as conspiracy points, and we are describing these. And if these houses in the forests are still preserved, there are all sorts of commemoration notes to remember them as major points of conspiracy. You've mentioned a number of points and places, and if we look at deportations from the areas of Cracow district, we've got this book to commemorate Poles and a number of repressions and group arrests and people engaged in conspiracy. These are the regions which you've mentioned in your contributions, so we can see this intensity of activities and the scale of repressions against those who had had been in the conspiracy. The Institute of National Remembrance addresses issues relating to foresters. We can ask Mr. Krzysztof Pięciak to tell us a bit more about that. We have this information in publications which we produce as the Institute, because one of our missions relates to themes dating back to the Second World War. And as regards foresters and forest workers, we do not have a publication which would provide a comprehensive picture of forest workers, but there are a number of publications relating to particular persons, individuals, commanders in partisan troops. Many of these were foresters, and the speaker before me mentioned several persons. I would refer to others, like a graduate of the Forest Department of the Polytechnic of Lviv. And there are other motives, that is, foresters on the side of the occupiers. There were attacked by Home Army or other diversion groups. There are these motives in the history of the organizations, a variety of the conspiracy organizations, reporting to the Home Army, and we've got the engagement of landowners who, like the Stadnicki family, who owned forests. And what is the conclusion, or what are the conclusions that we can reach talking about that? I can use the example of my own research, because I've authored a book which came out last year about the organization operating in the region of Łódź, mainly between the towns of Wieluń and Częstochowa. And if we look at the conspiracy there and how it got developed from 1939, there were a number of forest workers. In December 1939, a secret underground military organization was being formed. The commander, Biedal, said that each night we should expect that the Polish army in France would be sending its envoys to Poland, and the forest would be their first shelter, and the forest worker could be the first one to come and help. So we've got this presumption that foresters and forest workers would get engaged in that area, which had been incorporated in the Third Reich. And very quickly we've got forest workers there who would then be performing a variety of activities, like one of the prominent workers. Most of these places were operating in conspiracy. Captain Marcin Stachecki, and there were various establishments throughout the area with partisan bases where forests were being supervised. In the region of Działoszyn, foresters became commanders of conspiracy establishments, even though this was not due to the fact that they were foresters, but they had been in the reserve forces of the Polish army. It seems quite likely that they were engaging in smuggling people through the borders
na terenie, który
within the areas, cutting through extensive forests south of Wieluń. And then in 1944, many foresters were within the army of supporting those who were to
brać udział w zajęciu najważniejszych terenów, a później
carry out some background operations during the uprising, and
na tym terenie
on that area police functions were being assumed as well.
Natomiast myślę, że o skali zaangażowania
I think that the scale of commitment and engagement is quite extensive. There were more than 2,000 people, and we know a number of names of foresters who were engaged actively, including the commanders and the deputies and commanders of different establishments who in the summer of 44, when they were preparing to collect supplies from the west, which ultimately did not arrive, but they were getting ready for that. They were commanding various points where these supplies were to be arriving. And then when in 1945 the front came, and it was becoming necessary for the Home Army to go into conspiracy, the supervisory authority of Paźmiechy was established. The Potocki land, Count Potocki was a forester by education, different areas there, and then one of the divisions of the Home Army went into conspiracy there, and that was Henryk Jacuński, who commanded one of the troops, and then who was assistant to one of the commanders, and who was hiding under a false name and a false function of treasurer. And then in the forest administration of Lipie, we had a number of Home Army activists, either those who were working with them directly or cooperating with or helping them to work. And then there were other people involved, and when the commander of a division was leaving his formal function, one of the officers noted in his diary saying that he had been bidding farewell to Treasurer Pala because he was going to a different position. I didn't know who he was at the time, but I could guess that this function as a cashier or treasurer was just a pretense. And then that did not end the cooperation between foresters and conspiracy activists. And there were anti-communist activities going on, and most of these activities were again based on a number of establishments within forests. There were contact points established. Some of the weapons from the Home Army had been taken over to be used there. And several years later, one of the security workers said that uniforms and weapons had been stored and kept there. And there was a reference to the term of gang. That was a term imposed by the communists, and it was not really the case of all foresters being engaged in that activity, but it was quite a substantial scale, which is quite obvious.
zarówno wspomniany
Even though we know that some of the forest activists were arrested and sentenced to prison, and I think we can full stop at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your information. Thank you for some examples and references to sources and references to people we know from literature. And for collecting the stories regarding foresters. This is a challenge for historians still. A few words about the publication which already exists, which has been published by the State Museum of Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is the book on foresters. Piotr Kacprzak is the co-author of this book of Remembrance. This is a very exceptional publication. Unlike other books published by the museums, there was Warsaw Book of Remembrance for the Warsaw district or Cracow district. Those books regarded deportations to Auschwitz from a specific region, but this publication shows profession, people representing one profession. What's the acceptance of this book among the employees of state forests? With reference to the speech of the gentleman from the Institute of National Remembrance, there is no collective book on the participation of foresters in the Second World War. There were many aspects of their activities. This publication on foresters who perished in Auschwitz and who were imprisoned here shows it's a collective, information about foresters based on those documents which are kept in the archives in Auschwitz, or if they are family collections. In case of publication, we need always a question mark, because frequently the same person was in one camp, in another one, and then they died. It was also presented yesterday that 205 people, including 170, died, so 25 persons lived, transferred somewhere else.
Jaki jest odbiór tego?
What is the reception?
Otóż kiedy mnie poprosił pan prezes,
When I was asked by President Głogowski to become involved in this book,
to proszę mi sformułować,
I
co ja mam napisać tak naprawdę.
asked him, what should I write? Some chapter, subchapter. So I was to write about the situation which was created in August, September and October 1939 in Poland. And what legal acts regarded forests during the war. Well, one thing was missing, one document was missing, something which would show foresters from the point of view of civil authorities of the Home Army. Foresters worked for the needs of the Third Reich. How to approach that? So it was not regarded as something wrong. On the contrary, it was regarded as a control on what's going on. So in some troops, in some military storages, or sending messages. So foresters were active because they could move from place to place. Not everyone had this possibility. So you need to see some positive aspects. What's the reception of this book? It's good that this publication
Pokazuje
is
pewną
here
taką jak gdyby
because we show
informacje,
some collective information
obozami było. Z tym, że
on
ja akurat
concentration
reprezentuję
camps.
dyrekcję radomską
I represent Radom
z Radomia.
Directorate.
W Auschwitz zginęło chyba 30
So 39 persons died in Auschwitz, and in 9 other camps, all other from my directorate died.
Tam też ginęli leśnicy.
Also foresters died
Generalnego
in
gubernatora
other concentration camps in Germany, in Austria, in general governorship.
również
There
transportowano
are,
tych
so foresters were transported there
z generalnego gubernatorstwa, którzy
too.
właśnie najczęściej byli członkowie
So these were members of military conspiration, resistance movement, or sometimes they were accidentally arrested.
Odbiór, proszę Państwa, tej publikacji
That book is really well received by
potomków, o tak powiem, tych,
family members of those who died here.
kontaktowaliśmy się czasem
When we
z
contacted
tak,
with grandchildren,
kogoś przez kogoś, no to był zaskoczony, że
and they were surprised, oh, you are writing about my father, about my grandfather.
co ja wam mogę pomóc, może
How can I help you? I can give you a photo.
ja to czasami nazywam,
So they extended their helping hands. There will be another panel discussion later on, and they will be
również ten aspekt tutaj
probably mentioning this.
podniosą, bo to
aspect.
jest naprawdę bardzo ważne. W każdym bądź razie
It's really important.
na pewno oddźwięk jest bardzo pozytywny.
So the reception is really very positive,
Którzy tutaj w Auschwitz
especially of family members of those who died in Auschwitz. Wojtek Bomba is here with us. His grandfather died in Auschwitz. We know his number.
Także taka pamięć też jest. No.
So we remember.
Tak, to prawda.
That's true.
Tutaj
When
w moim przypadku w dziale
I work here in the research center, in the educational
w tych
center,
sytuacji spotykamy wiele,
we
kiedy
encounter such situations when
ta zachowana pamięć, spisana
remembrance
pamięć, która jest
and
dostępna,
something written down,
zdjęcie, tak jak pan
photos,
uzupełnienie tych losów,
supplementing of the fate, or talking about those persons who died is so important. So we encounter such gratitude.
Takie potwierdzenie
It
tego,
confirms
że tą pracę absolutnie należy kontynuować.
that the work should be continued.
Myśl o tym, że właśnie z rejonu, z którego pan pochodzi,
So as you say,
pracuje,
in the region where you work, where you come from,
inni jeszcze byli deportowani do innych obozów.
the number is higher. Other people were deported to other concentration camps. So their stories should be written down. So this is our postulate. Let's encourage others to dwell on some scientific work. May I add something? Sure. Foresters who worked in the state forest administration before the war,
Również w prywatnych lasach
but also in private forests,
składali przyrzeczenie.
made a promise, or they made an oath,
Nikt ich z tego przyrzeczenia nie zwolni.
and nobody released them from that oath.
Przyrzekali Bogu i Ojczyźnie.
So they made an oath to God and Poland.
Dziękujemy bardzo. No właśnie, wspomnieliśmy o
Thank you very much. We mentioned life, remembrance.
przygotowywane właśnie przez
Publications prepared by the Home Army in Museum in Cracow cover the area of Małopolska.
lokalnej pozostało jeszcze
So,
bardzo
in
wiele
local remembrance, there are a number of events and persons related directly with partisan
jak żywa
troops.
pamięć pozostała.
How lively is this remembrance?
Arkadiusz Bąk.
Arkadiusz Bąk, please.
Praca nad tym
Work
przewodnikiem
on the guide
pokazała nam
showed
wyraźnie, że
us
w tej lokalnej
clearly
społeczności,
that in the local community,
jedziemy w ten teren, to
when you go there,
pamięć o Armii Krajowej jest bardzo
remembrance
żywa.
about Home
Mimo, że już,
Army is
minęło
quite vivid,
blisko 80
although
lat
it's
od tych wydarzeń.
8 years later,
Za chwilę minęło już 80 lat od rozpoczęcia wojny, za chwilę będzie
8 years
80
after the
lat
Second
zakończenia.
World, we will soon celebrate 80 years of the end.
Wydarzenia
of the war.
mają charakter różnorodny.
So they were different
To też zależy od
events.
tego,
It
kto
depends
inicjuje,
on
kto jest
who
organizatorem
initiates
tych różnych
different
oddolnych inicjatyw polegających
grassroots
na
initiatives. remembering
tych miejsc pamięci związanych z Armią Krajową? Czy to będą władze
the Home Army, local government and other local cultural institutions, libraries,
czy
community
też to
houses,
będą organizacje pozarządowe, które
or maybe
często wypełniają
NGOs,
tą lukę w miejscach,
which
gdzie ta działalność
fill out some gaps where the activities of other entities is not so intense.
kooperują i współdziałają.
But they also cooperate
I tworzą naprawdę super fajne rzeczy.
and they create wonderful things which we also described in the book and
Ponieważ
we used them in our book. In Małopolskie region there are a lot of races,
żołnierzy
a lot
wyklętych,
traces of
zarówno
soldiers,
rowerowe,
so,
motocyklowe, samochodowe,
biking, motorbike, car, or there is a horse race from Oświęcim to Nowy Wiśnicz,
szlakiem Witolda Pileckiego.
following the route of Witold Pilecki. Based on those races where collaboration is good, there are educational and historic paths in the forestry of Limanowa in collaboration with the Służnice community. In Mogielice mountain, 2 educational and historic paths were created. The first one,
imienia Juliana Krzewickiego.
Julian Krzewicki, Szczepan path. So he was the commander of the Limanowa area, and the other one, partisan trail of Wilk to Mogielica. Both paths have a lot of information boards,
poszczególnych
including
wydarzeń, które się w tych miejscach
descriptions of events
z leśniczówkami czy gajówkami.
related to foresters' lodges. One of the stops of the places is Andrzeja Florka, Forester's Lodge. There is an information board there. There are some
stacjonował najpierw oddział partyzancki Wilk, potem pierwszy batalion pierwszego PSPAK. Tutaj
places, commemoration places there.
od tego miejsca pod krzyżem, który w tej chwili jest przy szlaku zielonym na
There is a cross at the green rail trail. Some partisans' masses were held there, and Independence Day was celebrated there.
operacyjnej Śląsk-Cieszyński
Śląsk-Cieszyński operation group met there, gathered there. One of the boards is commemorated to soldiers, foresters fighting in the years 1939, 1956. So fighting against the German occupant and the communist one. In Tymbark there is an education path.
Można wyróżnić
So here we can see Piekiełko place, which is dedicated to one of the founders of Tymbark conspiracy unit
Lisowskiego. Miał też pseudonim Lisowski.
His nickname was Lisowski. He worked in a wood cutting place, and he tried to go to France to join the Polish army. He was arrested in Slovakia. He was imprisoned, and with the first transport, he was sent to Auschwitz. His name was 329.
Tutaj podejmuje
And he
działalność konspiracyjną
started conspiracy activities here, cooperated with Witold Pilecki. On the 11th of October 1943 he was shot down. So this person is commemorated in Piekiełko place. Remembrance unit works, operates in a library in Tymbark. Szczawnica, which I also mentioned. Krościenko Forestry Unit cooperates with the Institute of National Remembrance. There is a partisans path with 3 points leading to the forest camp
a także do miejsca, gdzie ukrywali
and
się
also the
ostatni
place
żołnierze
where
wyklęci
last
w Małopolsce.
soldiers,
Czyli do grupy,
expelled soldiers were hiding.
Stanisława Perełki Dębińskiego.
Stanisław Perełka Dębiński
Takie ścieżki także
was the
powstają w
commander
innych
there.
regionach, na przykład
So
w masywie Łysiny.
in Łysina area, in Lubomir area, there is another path following in the trace of home army
Krajowej. Według
soldiers
samego projektu, bo w tej samej
in the
gminie
same
Raciechowice,
community, Raciechowice community. There is another path which commemorates
oddział śmiały w tym regionie, ale także
the troop of Śmiały and post-war anti-communist
Jana Dubaniowskiego salwę i podkomendnych tego salwy.
activities. So the commanders are commemorated there,
Tego miejsca
not far from the place,
w lesie na
in the
Grodzisku
forest at Grodzisko. They were buried there. There is one cross which commemorates this place, Gorce National Park.
Kilku
Among several educational paths, one is dedicated to partisans, Łopuszna Turbacz,
która opowiada,
and another path
opowiedziana jest doliną potoku Jaszcze, to ona prowadzi właśnie na Pańską Przechybkę, gdzie rozbił się 18
Pańska Przechybka, where
roku
in 1944
Liberator California.
Liberator California rocket plane the partisans hid those who survived from this catastrophe, and they spent Christmas Eve together, and then they could go to their country,
Jeszcze przykładami tej żywej pamięci
could go back to their countries.
podstawowe takie wydarzenia jak uroczystości rocznicowe.
So we commemorate important dates
Od wielu lat.
in some places. Celebrations are held every year.
Swego czasu były bardzo popularne. Teraz bardzo popularne są
What's
wydarzenia.
popular now are events in Dzielec, in Słupnice Górne,
Zrzuty dla pierwszego PSP-AK. To jest także właśnie
commemorating
związane ze zlotem walk szlakami partyzanckimi właśnie na suchej polanie
gifts received
między Kamiennikiem a Łysiną.
from planes,
I uroczystości
and also
w Gajówce Psiarskie,
Gajówka Psiarska in Bydlińskie Mountains in Olkusz area,
organizowane są rajdy i inne uroczystości
where there are some celebrations.
lokalnych tamtych
Local authorities,
przedstawicieli organizacji pozarządowych.
local NGOs
Odbywają się
are involved in them.
W tym miejscu
There are some races in Bydlińskie Mountains.
kwaterowali partyzanci
This is where partisans from Hardy
wszedł w skład batalionu Surowiec.
troop were active
A
there.
wywodził się z Gwardii Ludowej Polskiej Partii Socjalistycznej, a następnie szedł w skład Armii Krajowej. I takich przykładów
So there are a number of examples in Piwniczna area,
łączyli się w tą działalność historyczną i
historic
tworzyli
activities are still
bazy
nourished.
PPAN-u, organizacji też powojennego podziemia, z której pewnie
there was
Państwo
an
kojarzą księdza
post
Gurgacza.
war
I tak
underground organization
to nadleśnictwa lasy
with priest Gurgacz.
Armii Krajowej i żołnierzy
So commemoration activities are very strong. Thank you very much.
Tutaj Pan wspomniał wiele miejsc, wiele wydarzeń.
Mentioned a number of places and
Pierwszy właśnie taki
events,
rajd,
and I remember the first of
droga,
the
którą uciekał rotmistrz Pilecki.
routes
Organizowana.
escape path of
Później uczestnicy troszkę
Pilecki, and that was the first of these, and then this has been modified, and this is horse riding
Pan wspomniał przy
route now, and other events that you've mentioned with the local tourist organization structures.
wydarzenia bardzo dobrze przygotowane.
These are really very well prepared in terms of
ale również ten aspekt
tourist aspects, but the historical aspect is
wyjaśniony.
very much emphasized and explained to the participants. So these are noteworthy
Też uczestniczenia, o ile
events and worth to take part in as far as possible.
przy
So
postulatach badawczych
if we are talking about research postulations and various initiatives, when we look at the development of research, what
przybliżyć
new aspects could we bring closer to readers in terms of foresters, conspiracy organizations,
konspiracji, nazwanych również
soldiers of so-called second conspiracy, so-called curse soldiers, Mr. Krzysztof Pięciak. The speaker before me, my distinguished colleague here, has presented and outlined a number of these themes.
Jest jeszcze kilka takich, o których
And
wspomnieć.
still, there are some other
Chronologicznie ujmując
aspects which I could mention. I started chronologically from 1939. I'll go back to that. During the first years of German occupation, there were many grassroots conspiracy organizations which were set up. We know that they were there. We might not know a lot about these.
Jeśli chodzi o teren
And as far as the region of Małopolska is concerned, we do not really know whether there was a conspiracy organization of foresters, what the name was, or maybe it was in operation for a short period of time only, or maybe that was incorporated within the home army, or dispersed by the occupiers. We don't know a lot about them. Maybe we'll get some deeper insight. And also, talking about this conspiracy engagement of foresters, upon reflection, we might think that most of the forest service workers had been engaged in conspiracy. But we need to remember that during the Second World War, Germans were replacing staff and introduced their own people within various offices and organizations and authorities. In many places, they replaced Polish forest workers with Germans, and also those coming from different localities. So the question is what the situation was like and how foresters functioned under the German occupation. And this also touches upon the issue of collaboration between various people and Germans. We know that there was someone set up, introduced into the structures, and that was someone who was not was a sort of ambiguous person. Some were saying that he was helping people, some were saying that he was helping but for a bribe, or maybe he was collaborating with Gestapo. And there was yet another person who was identified as an agent of German services, and he was done away with, so to speak. So the question might be posed how foresters were used by occupiers. So was it just were these just individuals, or was it a larger scale thing? And how about the German forest services? We know some local threads and how this worked in the locality of Kraśnik. I don't know whether this is more widely known throughout Poland. And yet another question arises, whether in forests Germans were undertaking agent-related activities. And the same question perhaps can be asked about what was going on after 1945. There were provocations by the security office, security services, and that was used to fight against the anti-communist underground movements in Małopolska, not only there. There are a number of questions, though, but I don't want to sound as someone who is talking about a sort of negative things, but I believe that there are some research postulations which can be put forward and maybe further explored. I know that the themes that you are working on relates to the so-called second conspiracy, and we know that the presence in forests,
pracowników służby lasów państwowych.
The engagement of forest administration staff was a major aspect.
Mógłby się pan z nami tak wstępnie podzielić?
Could you share some research results with us to encourage us to get into it? The second conspiracy, all of that I was mentioning, that is whatever happened after 45 and 46.
Partyzanckim Babiniczem. W moim przekonaniu
As
to, co było
I see it,
działalności w tej współpracy,
what was most important in that was establishing a network of contacts between which partisans could
widać to zresztą w topografii,
move, and that's quite characteristic. If we look at the places where partisans could stop, were quite desolate places, remote. There was always water nearby, and within forest complexes from which it was relatively easy to travel to other areas. So natural bases, and the partisans were using that quite consciously. If we look at the region of Małopolska, we've got this prominent figure, activist here, Stanisław Pióro, who was a forester as well. But then again, the motive is back here, that is specific people who were engaged in a conspiracy activities. Thank you.
Dużo dowiedzieliśmy się
We've learned a lot about
na temat tego, co
what was going on and what research has been done, but we know that there is still a lot to be done. And then maybe a contribution
odbioru
individually from yourselves here, the work that you have already done.
Rozumiem, że w przypadku pana z Muzeum
I understand that the representative of the Home Army Museum or the Institute of National Remembrance, the matter of foresters being engaged in these activities, this comes out throughout the research.
Te działania, ale no tak to jest w tej pracy, gdzie w większości
most of the work is about people and events.
Wydarzenia, pewne rzeczy
And some
tak zostają.
developments stay with us for longer.
Zaczynamy się
And we are beginning to
drążymy.
think about them more intensively. We get deeper into the details. So a summarizing, a concluding question maybe about this history which ended here for many in Auschwitz. How is it staying with you, so to speak?
Piotr Kacprzak.
Mr. Piotr Kacprzak.
Nie tylko może to pytanie, ale taka...
It's not really only a question, but maybe a form of reflection or observation. There are several of us foresters here who are fascinated by history, but what we perhaps do not have in sufficiency, like a central point to somehow identify them all and put them together, in the sense that if there are some elaborations, to have that put together. There are quite interesting materials about foresters from the region of Toruń or Wielkopolska or Radom, but these are regional in their nature, so to speak. But perhaps it would be good if that followed a certain theme based on what has already been explored, to look at certain things nationwide, so to speak. I'm not sure whether this is a task for the institute, but what I would like to see is a place where these people could come together, because we all do quite a lot in different places in Poland. Also Krosno, apologies to the director here, there is quite a strong historical group there, but these are regional bits, like the years of 1945-56. Maybe these foresters could be somehow put together to show what the situation was like in different regions of Poland. We tend to forget about the region of Mazurian, where people had to leave for a variety of reasons, like from the area of the region of Kielce after the war. So people were leaving various areas because that was the reality they had to face. Certainly we should not stop this work. Maybe we should somehow assemble these ideas, put them together, and that would be a major benefit to document history. Just an example, there is a biographical note about someone who has perished in a concentration camp. We do not know where. Was it here in Auschwitz, or was it the camp of Majdanek, or maybe yet another place, like wherever in Germany or in Austria. So we do not know where that particular person perished. Maybe, and then all of a sudden I find out that it was, my grandfather or someone of my family, but people would not associate these facts. Arkadiusz, to words about looking at the developments of home army and partisans. There is sometimes no information saying that a person was a forester, for example. So then you have to go back to some recollections or exchange of letters, and that throws new light, fresh light on certain activities, why this happened in this particular manner, and that was because of the activity of a certain person who had been a forester by education. So, getting ready for this conference, I took a slightly different approach.
Brakowało tego właśnie spojrzenia też z punktu widzenia.
We didn't have that look from this point of view. If we look at biographies of some people and say, well, this particular person was a forester, but if we look at whole troops of partisans, when we have various actions or marches or conspiracy or activities, so we do not not have this knowledge.
Jacy to byli ludzie?
What
jakie
kind of
zawody
people
pełnili?
these were, what occupations or professions they represented, and that also had an effect on the effectiveness of these partisan actions, whether they would succeed or not. So,
że to dotyczy
no.
zarówno zawodu leśnika, ale
so
także,
this is true about the profession of forester, but we would need to take a slightly different approach to see how many teachers there were, or landowners, of people who were officers within the Polish army and under cover of foresters or postmen.
budowali te struktury
They were
ruchu oporu.
developing these resistance movement structures because this particular profession allowed them to move about the area. There were restrictions to movement, as we know, but certain professions made it easier to travel and to move from place to place. So that's just a quick reflection. Thank you very much. And at the end,
Krzysztofa.
Krzysztof. I'll try to be brief. Well, I can only endorse what speakers before me were saying. Doing my own research, I was trying to look at these stories in biographical terms. Some of the information I've presented comes from interviews with people I was mentioning, and this is a living history. In fact, and it's both those directly involved and their family members who remember that, and local residents remember that, and they would know who was engaged, and they know perfectly well and remember who helped these partisans, and can identify particular people, and that could be an interesting starting point for the research into the conspiracy. And I can use my own example. I'm looking at that as a historian, but also this is my own family history, because people in my family had been engaged in conspiracy, and this is where I actually started my own research. Thank you. And in conclusion, I will add my own little contribution, going back to the publication of the book of commemoration of Polish forest workers. And I was really glad to read an article about students in a forest school who had practical training with us, and the space where the were kept is the block is opposite the block I'm working in. Throughout the time of their work, I saw pupils standing, then first in uniforms, then in some working clothes, and they set off to work at 7 in the morning, and that continued for a number of years. We saw them within the premises and in Birkenau, and I remember Zbigniew Dyner, who was coming with them for a number of years. And so they've remained in our good memories. I wish to thank our panelists very much, and they all deserve an applaud. I'm sure of that. And I thank you for your attention as well. I wish to thank the panelists, the moderator, for this very interesting conversation. And we now have a short break until 12:15, and we'll start another discussion panel after the break.
Szanowni Państwo, zapraszam do zajęcia miejsc. Rozpoczynamy drugą część dzisiejszej konferencji.
Today,
Państwa po przerwie.
welcome after the break.
Państwa zaprosić do wysłuchania
Now we'll have a panel discussion on family remembrance with the participation of families of survivors from Auschwitz. Wanda Nowicka, Małgorzata Trojanowska, Eleonora Szafran, Józefa Posz-Kotyrba. And this discussion will be moderated by Father Lucjan Bielas.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much.
Zaoszczędzono mi tą przyjemność powitania.
So, I'm very happy
Panie podjęły się uczestniczenia w tym panelu, które
that you will participate in this panel discussion.
potrzeby serca i rozumu.
We need this discussion. This is the need of our hearts, because
Tej pamięci
touching of remembrance
jest potrzebą serca.
is the need of our hearts, especially when it comes to daughters.
Wychowania
This is what happens in the
kobieta
upbringing process.
daje
A woman in the family creates
a nagrywarką jest głos ojca.
like a studio, music studio. I remember
O głosie
when we were
ojca.
preparing for this discussion, you mentioned the voice of your father.
Ponieważ jestem wychowankiem
I've been brought up
Wolskiego,
by
historyka starożytnego z UJ-u,
Wolski of the Jagiellonian University,
więźniem
who was the last
Sachsenhausen.
prisoner of Sachsenhausen.
Zmarły. Dożył 98 roku życia przy genialnej pamięci i wiem, ile ja zawdzięczam osobowości profesora.
And the professor
Ale osobowości
had a wonderful personality apart from knowledge. And I'm very happy that you've undertaken to do it, to take part in this discussion, because the task is serious. How to speak about those events to the next generation. The next generation is
cierpi na
suffering digital dementia, as contemporary researchers call it. This is what researchers say about the young generation. How to speak about those difficult things. You have the text of Piotr Pietrzykowski from Auschwitz, a boxer from Auschwitz. Those who survived concentration camp or avoided pass on to the young generation about the inhuman time. It's not time to forget yet.
Dlatego też pierwszym naszym pytaniem,
So our first question that I want to address to you
czy jest jakieś wspomnienie,
is, do you have any memories kept by the family remembrance
chciałyby Pani
that you would like to
powiedzieć, podzielić
refer to and share that experience?
wspomnienie, które można powiedzieć w tym bogatym przekazie taty.
Some memories of your father,
I tu bym poprosił
about your father, which are crucial to you.
poseł Wandę Nowicką,
Wanda Nowicka,
która jest wychowywana
who was
na dwóch ojców,
brought up
dwaj związani z
by two fathers, both of them related to a concentration camp.
pana
We are remembering today Mr. Kazimierz Albin. So the floor is yours.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this discussion panel. It's a very moving event. It's a very personal event for me, because so far I have never spoken about my father in public.
Ponieważ ksiądz już o tym wspomniał.
Since you mentioned it, I want to say that although I'll be speaking about my stepfather, that is Kazimierz Albin, also my biological father was in Auschwitz. This is where they made friends, and they were friends until the end of their lives, although their destinies were very different. Kazimierz Albin brought me up and my brother up from the early childhood.
No to był taki właściwie ojciec na co dzień.
So he was my regular father for us. But let me say that Kazimierz Albin was a person who didn't live by martyrology, although his stormy war experience could be the base for a screenplay for a movie, for many movies. How I remember him, I don't know if you realize, but Kazimierz Albin was the prisoner of the first transport. That's we are all here. So he spent 2 years in Auschwitz until he escaped, which was one of very few escapes from Auschwitz concentration camp, very few successful escapes. I think he escaped from 2 or 3 friends. So when he managed to escape, he joined the resistance movement and was fighting militarily for free Poland until the end. He had a lot of adventures he had during the war, and his memoirs he described in the book List Gończy, which you can buy. So on my way here, I read it again. I know this book very well. I'm terrified again with the experience, his experience and other inmates' experiences. But at the same time, I want to emphasize that a dominating feature of Albin was his desire to live and to enjoy life, even in the most difficult moments. Let me quote just one sentence from this book, which shows his character. This is the sentence he wrote in his memoirs when he was imprisoned, one of many prisons. He was arrested before he came to Auschwitz, and he was writing about a walk. During a short walk in the prison, after tortures, we delighted in the spring sun, and we were so happy to breathe with fresh air, and the world seemed to be beautiful, and you wanted to shout with joy. So he grasped those moments, in those extreme dramatic, moments. Despite the cruelties he suffered, he enjoyed life. He was caught when he tried to reach a Polish army in France. He was caught, and when he realized that he was crossing the mountains in January, he was going through Poland, Slovakia. He didn't reach Hungary. He described the beauty of the landscape around him in this tragic moment. So he wrote those memoirs when he retired. It's also quite characteristic for him. So the life of a mature person. He had some career, professional career, but he didn't focus on Auschwitz. Only after did he retire, he started a new life when symbolically he returned to Auschwitz. This is when he became involved in creating an organization to preserve remembrance about Auschwitz. The Association on Remembering Auschwitz. It was 30 years. He died in 2019. He was almost 100 years old. So he focused, for 30 years, he focused on remembrance and preserving remembrance for next generations. He was a member of the International Oświęcim Board Committee. He traveled to the world with lectures, and he talked to young people. He was talking to Japanese people, students, Japanese students who were listening to his story. He was a wonderful storyteller. This book is very well written, and despite all those tragic events, it's written in such a way that you are not depressed after reading it, because humanism won. And let me say one more thing. As I said, in my childhood, together with my brother, we were not so much interested. We didn't ask questions, although I regret it. But here we have the book, fortunately. But one thing which I remembered when my dad was talking about it. So he successfully escaped from Auschwitz, but his experience was so awful. Mother was taken to Auschwitz, brought to Auschwitz. His sister was persecuted. Finally, she was not imprisoned, but his mother, after Auschwitz, was taken to Ravensbrück. And only after the Second World War she came back. And his brother Mieczysław Albin, they shared the experience, although they didn't escape together from Auschwitz. But Mieczysław was persecuted in the concentration camp after his brother had escaped. He survived, but he suffered a lot. So this feeling of guilt, the sense of guilt, people have to fight and do everything to save oneself, to accomplish the goal. He was a fighter. But he had this feeling that his escape also contributed to some damage in the family, and this was a very painful experience for him. And he mentioned that several times. So this is all from me for now.
Thank you.
Język niemiecki, który
German language, which he mastered in one of the top-class secondary general schools in Cracow, helped him a lot, and his being a scout not helped him a lot as well. Listening to him and his balanced personality, and also the fact that he transformed problems into opportunities, and his escape, how he managed as a scout, and his later life, and his being true to his scout oath. That was no joke. That was a consequence of his life, and what I'm really interested is in the personality itself, the face, and I do admire his internal peace with all the traumas that he must have had in himself.
te represje.
And the repressions later.
Wielka rzecz.
That's really
znajomość języka
something.
niemieckiego.
His command of German helped him, saved him. Perfect manners and boxing as well.
Czy możemy poprosić?
Another of our heroes. Can we ask? I'm daughter of Tadeusz Pietrzykowski, Teddy, number 77.
Warszawskiego pięściarza, mistrza Warszawy,
Warsaw boxer, a master of Warsaw, just like Albin. He was trying to get to the Polish army in France. He was caught on the border, the Hungarian-Yugoslavian border in the town of Pécs. My father did not fully realize what would happen to him after he was in prison. The first prison he went to was in Muszyna, then Tarnów, and then from Tarnów to Auschwitz. When he got here today, at 3:10, he didn't realize what lied ahead, and he spent 1,766 days there in the camps. That's really dreadful, but did not break him down.
Oświęcimiu
Here in
boksował.
Auschwitz he kept boxing, and that was quite noticeable. He was 23 years of age, and his aim was to survive. But the first fight he had here in Auschwitz was with a German capo, Walter Dunning, and that fight was not resolved clearly, even though Dunning had cut on his eyebrow. That was the first drop of blood. So that opened a space for my father.
Kiedy Niemiec spytał się go,
when the German asked him,
do jakiegoś komanda,
where would you like to go to a commando? And my father said, well, yes, would like to go to a commando and work with animals. And that
bardzo krótkim czasie
that over a short period of time he became like a toy in the hands of Germans, in the sense that sports, boxing, they liked that, so they thought, well, yes, it was nice if a Paul was a boxer, a sportsman. He will be able to do some boxing with other prisoners who were transported to Auschwitz. The first fight for life, really special, and opened up opportunities for him to help his colleagues, to find food and to share it. And we can see a trait of that young man being 23 years of age, trying to cope with all of it. He wanted to live. He wasn't in any sort of depression. He had this anger in him, this lack of being humble. He wanted to survive, and he wanted his colleagues, other prisoners who were closer to him than brothers and family. These ties were deeply emotional between prisoners. He became a symbol of free Poland to him. They were shouting in the ring when he was winning. Teddy fight with the German, conquer him. They were showing him how important the idea was, that if a Pole was winning, maybe Poland would stand up after the German occupation. That was very important to show the human face at every single possible moment. When he met Witold Pilecki, when he was amongst his close assistants. He was saying about himself that he was his assistant when there was a deep emotional tie between them. My father went to Warsaw quite often. He visited Zofia Pilecka, the daughter of Captain Pilecki. So that was one person on his path. The other person which made a deep impression on him was Father Maximilian Maria Kolbe. He gave him bread, he was helping him, and it was in his defense that he stood, risking his own life. Even Maximilian Kolbe was saying, son, don't fight, don't hit. Maybe someone else needs this bread more than I do. Maybe someone else is more hungry than I am. To my father, these were suggestions hard to understand, really. He did not imagine not to have this goal in his mind to survive, that you're a worthy person. He didn't see at that time the sanctity of Maximilian Kolbe. That came in time. It's noticeable to remember his saying, he repeated in the family and elsewhere. He addressed Maximilian Kolbe by saying, Father, please pray for me, and nothing else. He bore witness to Father Maximilian Kolbe being taken to cell number 11, the cell of death. He knew that he had perished. All of his life after the war, it was a symbol to him, a symbol of being deeply humane, because he sacrificed his life for someone else. To me, my father, my dad is a hero. All of them who were here within Auschwitz, who perished, and those who survived, they were all heroes, because you had to be very heroic to exist, to be able to exist here. Well, if fate wanted it, they perished, that's clear. But as my dad mentioned, he was fighting to give hope to these people, to give them hope for survival, to have a goal in their eyes, to live, to be able to tell the story after the war, to bear witness to what had been happening here. That's immense responsibility. I said briefly before the conference that my dad, when he returned to Poland, he made his first steps to Oświęcim. He didn't come after 10, 20 or 30 years. He came immediately because Auschwitz was in him. And he lived with it. And that was not a simple life, because his fate was interesting, really very interesting. You can read about him in my book about Teddy Pietrzykowski, based on his accounts and other documents I've collected. My dad was talking, and that was his mission, to tell everyone what it had been like here. That life mission sort of passed on to me, and I'm talking, I'm telling a story of the tragic times about someone who was fighting with all his strength, he passed the exam of being human and passed exam in friendship and courage in that apocalyptic, dreadful times. Here today in Auschwitz, I come to here and walking amongst the barracks, I feel really exceptional because I'm stepping on the graveyard of Europe, on the blood shed by a variety of nationalities, not only Poles. We know about the Holocaust and Jews, millions of people, thousands of Poles. And that history has to survive. Our fathers, Kazimierz, Albin, my dad, father of Ms. Trojanowska, they all bore witness to what had been happening here. My reflection today is that we need to talk as much as we can about it, to address the widest circles possible. And my experience is also reflective.
Niedużo, znaczy trudno powiedzieć, dużo, niedużo,
meaning that, well, there are statements sometimes by people saying they haven't been to Oświęcim, they haven't seen it. Journalists sometimes,
na przykład prowadzą rozmowę na
if they have an interview about a place like this, they should be here, they should read all the information here, and they are not doing that. And these are not children or young people, these are adults who have their own professions, important ones like journalists, and who are not doing what they should be doing. That should change generally.
Ja jestem drugą generacją.
I'm the second generation.
Duża odpowiedzialność.
And that's huge responsibility for me.
Bardzo jestem wzruszona, że dzisiaj
really
Państwu właśnie opowiedzieć troszeczkę o moim tacie właśnie w ten sposób.
Talk about my father like this here.
Tak. Dzisiaj, kiedy jest kryzys
Today, when we have the crisis of real, true men, deficit of true men,
mężczyzna, który walczy.
a man who fights.
Jeszcze tam jeden wątek jest, który mnie piknął. Mianowicie.
And there's another thing. He's painting. What did he paint? Madonnas.
I to piękne.
Beautiful Madonnas. So a fighting man who wants to give the sense of safety to his wife.
Właśnie przeszedł. Madonna.
So Madonna. He was arrested when he went to church for the May celebrations to St. Mary. May Mass. So he went to St. Mary's Church in Krakow and he said it was a miracle.
Właśnie. Pan Roman Trojanowski. Czy możemy panią
Mr. Roman Trojanowski.
To wspomnienie.
Małgorzata Trojanowska, can we ask you about your memories about this unusual man? I read his memoirs.
Stamtąd pod tym tytułem.
So stories from there, and it was really, I was touched by it.
Mój ojciec,
my father,
został przewieziony,
when he was transported to Auschwitz, was 19.
I w Auschwitz został numerem 44.
His number was 44. Let's stay with the number. In the post-war generation, this number doesn't say anything, but for the pre-war generation, we associated this number with the poem and his number is 440. So some people were jealous of this number. So my father stayed 2 years in prison. He was released on the 1st of April 1942.
Nigdy nie dowiedział się,
He never learned
komu to zawdzięcza.
why.
Przeważnie
Usually,
wypuszczani w ten czas, kiedy rodzina odpowiednio zapłaciła.
Prisoners were released when the family paid to Germans. His family were very poor, but probably Ms. Schwarz helped my father. He was cleaning her house. The wife of Ms. Schwarz was an SS man who played some role in releasing prisoners. He, for instance, wrote certificates that somebody is not needed for work. So my father was released from prison, and he was sent to Bound Instalowa Wola. This was forced labor camp. He rarely spoke about the camp, but fortunately he retired and decided to write his memoirs. He didn't intend to publish them, so he did it just for his family. So he wrote down those memoirs. These were 10 stories. He designed the cover himself. He printed it and distributed it among family members and friends. When he died, he didn't think about publishing of his memoirs. I was wondering whether I should publish those memoirs or not. I expected some difficulties, but finally I turned to the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum for help. Everything was went on smoothly, despite the pandemic which was on the way. So at this point, let me thank the employees of the publishing house, especially the head, Jadwiga Pinderska-Lech. So it's a fresh book. So my father's memoirs were just published. Opowiadania stamtąd, stories from there. Ms. Pinderska suggested this title. Our family liked this title very much. Let me use this opportunity, and I want to encourage you to read those stories. I think they are interesting and well written. A number of prisoners wrote down their memoirs. They regard the same events, but they are remembered differently. In those memoirs you can find new, unknown things. For instance, with regard to SS officers and his families. My father, as one of the very few, was cleaning houses, officers' houses.
Jeżeli chodzi w ogóle o to, może jak zapamiętałam ojca, prawda?
How I remembered my father.
Był człowiekiem wyjątkowo pogodnym.
He was such a cheerful person, and he died with a smile on his face. I accompanied him when he died. It rarely happens, but this is what happened.
Był człowiekiem pracowitym i bardzo.
He was very hardworking. He was very active, but his principle was, and he repeated it to me many times: don't think about things that you cannot affect, which you cannot influence. And this is how I remembered it.
Wspomnienia z obozu.
His memories from the camp.
Ojciec miał takich kilka wspomnień,
he had several memories,
które, mówiąc szczerze,
which
powtarzał.
He repeated.
Wspomnienie ojca, które
the first memory of my dad, which returned from time to time, concerned
powiem, bo
Maybe I will say it.
zrobiło widocznie na ojcu jakieś większe
It made a big
wrażenie,
impression on my
aniżeli
father
inne
than
wydarzenia.
others.
Były tam działy się rzeczy okropne.
Horrible things happened there.
Dotyczyło to jednej
It concerned
zbiórek po ucieczce więźniów.
one of the selections after escapes of
Takie
some
wybiórki przeprowadzał sam zastępca komendanta.
escapes. Karl Fritsch, the deputy commander, made them. So he was just walking between rows of prisoners.
Przyglądał się
He looked
wnikliwie,
carefully
zanim
at them
wybrał ofiary.
before he selected victims.
Stał
And he stood, and another prisoner stood next to my father. He was so nervous and he was shaking.
zwrócił uwagę.
So Fritsch's attention was with that person. He stopped and asked him, "Why are you shaking so much?" And the prisoner said, "I'm afraid to die. I don't want to die." He has several small children.
Poprzez tłumacza,
There was a translator there
niemieckiego nie znał.
because that person didn't know German, didn't speak German. Fritsch answered,
W przyszłości uważał,
"In the future, you shouldn't show your irritation and nervousness because he would go to there," and he pointed to the chimney.
nie wystąpił z szeregu.
And the prisoner
Wyjaśnił mu, co powiedział komendant.
stood from the row.
Nie pozwolił już wrócić z powrotem do szeregu i powiedział, że jeżeli sam
And the commander said, if you walked out of the row, you should die because maybe this is your destiny.
Dziękuję bardzo.
That's all.
Serdecznie dziękuję.
Thank you very much.
Konkretna nauka. Nie zajmuj się tym, na co nie masz wpływu. To jest podstawowy zasad.
Concrete conclusion. Don't do things you have no idea about. You cannot have
Niesamowitą szkołą.
a say in.
Szczególnie wdzięczny osobiście.
Camp was special school of life, so to speak. I really, our father based descriptions of SS men. My family was expelled from a house in Jaworzno, and Brunopcel moved in. An SS man
Między innymi jako Raportführer rozstrzeliwał.
Who, as Raportführer, shot people dead by the wall of death, and then he was the commander of the gypsy camp, and then a camp in Jaworzno as a branch of KL Auschwitz.
W życiu mają rodzinę, z mieszkania, zamieszkał tam, a po wojnie moja rodzina wróciła do tego mieszkania.
My family lived from the apartment, and I inherited the collection of books and his items, and that was a source of uneasiness for me, but inspiration as well, and
I tak się złożyło.
prayer as well.
Miał wtedy w czasie wojny 2 lata
And
tak wszedłem w rodzinę.
became friends with his son, and then I sort of joined SS man's family, and my father showed me that life, and then family life, and that corresponded so much to what my father had seen. Yet another secret of
Pani profesor, Pani profesor znam
humans.
55 lat.
We've known with the professor for 55 years. She was teaching me mathematics. I was not a top student. Let me say it plainly. Mathematics is not my strong point. I can add up and multiply, but what intrigued me in Madam Teacher, in addition to her patience and understanding for my really poor results, the fact that she has 2 names. Why would a woman leave her family name. And her husband died, and she remarried Poszko Tyrba. So
przy tej pracy nad książką Leśnikami odkryły mi się pewne karty, patrzę.
Then I read these stories, and then I saw Posz, Karol Posz, and then names of Józef Posz and the family of my teacher, and then I understood why she continued to keep that Posz surname. It was not just a chance, a whim of a woman, but a need of the heart.
Słychać?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Muszę powiedzieć, że dzisiejsza uroczystość dla mnie ma wymiar wieloracji.
Can say that the ceremony today is multi-dimensional. It's the 14th of June, where first prisoners from Tarnów were brought to Auschwitz, and that included the manager of the children's home in Krzeszowice, where I was staying for a number of years. And the other thing I remember is that today this ceremony has featured foresters, and my great-grandfather came from Austria as a forester near Rajcza and Żywiec. And his sons and grandchildren had been engaged in that occupation. Yet another memory, type of memory, links to Auschwitz specifically. 9 people of my family perished, all of them who had come here. None of them left this camp alive. And memory also, another association is for me, when I was a child, when I was separated from my mom in the prison of Mysłowice. That started my journey as a small child, as a prisoner, and I was there as a minor child with my siblings. And just the term memory brings other associations as well, logically, meaning that memory is feature, characteristic that should be used by people for their short lives, to make these lives happy, not only their own lives, but lives of people around them. So the point is to live one's life to so that there are no wars, military conflicts, and with no victims, like the Second World War. Germans attacked Poland, many Poles died, but on the German side there were victims as well. Orphans were left, and some perished, and their families do not know where. So wherever that war happens, life of man becomes abnormal. So the question is what to do to have some positive effects of that memory. I'd like to say also, in Germany there is an association, Maximilian Kolbe-Werk, which works closely with former inmates of concentration camps, and I was the president of the Silesian branch. They have policy amongst German young people to get to know about the atrocities of the war caused by their nation. the ideas that living witnesses of history go to Germany and schools use their memories and reflections.
Tam również się wpływa w ten sposób,
and also
jako młodzi, do których będzie kiedyś
attempts are made for the young ones who will
prowadzili tę politykę, żeby ona nie
work in authorities to engage in policy which would not cause such dreadful events. And many German schools
uczniów na teren obozu Auschwitz. Między innymi 3 lata temu
bring their students to the site of the former camp. There was a group of girls who visited Auschwitz and Cracow, and in Katowice they had a meeting with 3 minor prisoners. One of them was born there, and myself and yet another person were also involved. My father worked in a mine. My uncle worked in the rail industry. My grandfather, my uncle was a forest manager, and I lived on the border of Jaworzno, where there was a branch of Auschwitz camp where prisoners were brought to work underground in a mine. And I worked and I lived at a place where in close proximity there was a belt of forests from Szczakowa to Dobra, Jeziorki down to Libiąż. So there were very good conditions here for the underground movement to get organized. And this is how it started there. And one day forest stations were seized, and because my grandfather was a forest manager, there was like a parallel attack with information that there was underground movement, they had weapons and they were dangerous. So on the night of the 14th and 15th July night, soldiers came to the house. My father was working a night shift, and they searched the house, they sealed the house. One of them went to get my father, and they returned without him. They didn't find him in the mine or at home, and they took us to the forest where there was a big prison vehicle with other family members inside of the vehicle, including a pregnant aunt, and they took us towards the city of Katowice. And on the way, I remember I had the name of Plegler. The door opened and someone came with his legs in chains. He left and we went to Katowice. 3 of us, me and my siblings, my sister and my brother and my mother, we were taken to Katowice. Our grandfather and grandmother and a pregnant aunt. We were taken to be interrogated, and then we were taken to that well-known prison in Mysłowice, and then after a time, the most terrible time came when children were separated from their families, screams, crying. I didn't know what was going on. War was not something I would realize what it was. And I remember that a truck came with children being thrown into it, and then I caught my mom neck, and that was the last moment when I saw my mother. And then in that truck we were taken somewhere, we didn't know where, and the family did not know where either. We were taken somewhere near Racibórz.
Budynek zagospodarowany na przyszłych więźniów.
And there was a building prepared for inmates, for prisoners. There were wooden beds there, and we were let into that room, that group of children, something like 3 weeks later. There were mass-scale arrests
gdzie znowu
in Silesia, where adults were sent to Mysłowice and the children were separated from their families. And it was only in 2016 that original German documents were found with dates and the children's ages in the building of Lagerführer on the roof. Someone who bought the building from nuns and renovating the building found documents in an ideal shape under the roof, and that lists 201 children, even a child of 2 weeks. So something like 240 children were located there.
Pewnego dnia przyjechała komisja rasowa.
Racial committee came, and then we were called, stood there naked, measured, they were making notes, and thereafter
Myśmy byli w takich, za jakieś 3 tygodnie przywieźli właśnie tą dużą grupę i wtedy
that big group was brought something like 3 weeks later, and amongst these children I saw my 3 cousins. My mother's sister with her husband had been engaged in an underground movement. They didn't find the uncle during the search, and the children were taken in that big group. And I remember I said, well, I'm so glad you are here because I saw familiar faces. And from there, in different groups, we were moved in Upper Silesia throughout the year, and these were so-called field camps, lagers, where children were not alone anywhere. And one of these lagers was near Racibórz, where a carpet factory was located. And then from there, a year later, we were taken to Bogumin, where in cattle carriages we were taken to Pomerania to Portulice near Nakło on the river of Noteć.
Powstał wyżej na mapie. Koło Gdańska
Near Gdańsk, there was a concentration camp, Stutthof, with a crematorium. People were kept there from the coast, and the Lagerführer started to construct in Potulice, where there was a church facility and families were resettled to the camp, whole families, while when we were brought, we were there just on our own, children only. And this is where a camp in Potulice was constructed with resettlers, some Polish children, and there were Belarusian children as well. And after the Warsaw Uprising, some people were sent there too. And then the new Lagerführer was there, and for children like us, conditions were really difficult because these children who were above the age of 9 could leave, go beyond the gate. Us younger children could not go. And then in Potulice, something like of the 240 children, there were something like 145 of us who reached that place in 2 transports. And there are dates and names in these original German documents. And my cousin, who was 14 months old, and he didn't have any milk or anything, after the liberation, we were liberated as late as 1945, so we had a lot of these barbed wires in front of our eyes for a long time, and there was some training for SS men, and we had an additional section. We were under the care of SS in 2 barracks. We looked really dreadful. My family perished. Some children went to Czelać while we remained there, and there was a list of children published in Gazeta Katowicka paper. Someone brought it to my grandma, and we went to hospital in Będzin, and my grandmother took us to raise us, and that little one was taken by the other grandmother, while the 5 of us really emaciated, and all sorts of scars and wounds, and then that's my memory. And I worked for nearly 40 years in a school, and I never talked about my story. And when the Katowice television made a film of 40 minutes, and everyone was surprised, asking me why you didn't talk before, but as you said, that was the beginning. Well, for 2 years maybe she would come and I would not recognize her, and then life developed, went on, and wanted to become independent. And only when I retired, it was too late, because my family members perished and died. But what I'm doing now is all I can to encourage young people to dream and to do honest work and not to fight, and to be able to talk. We've got little time.
I hope we will manage it and we'll finish on time. There is a question. All of you
poczuły w pewnym momencie pewną potrzebę serca, umysłu,
had this need in your heart to speak about it. We operate as mirrors. We are here in the room.
tej sali się odbija, wraca z powrotem do nas bardziej obiektywne.
And what comes back to us is more objective. Do you have some experience of how to speak?
Krótko podzielić z nami
Can you share it with us? How to speak
młodego pokolenia
to the young generation about those
tego daru
times
z tymi
so that
doświadczonymi ojcami
the gift
życiowymi trudnymi sytuacjami nie zmarnowali.
is not wasted. The gift we have is not wasted. Can we ask you?
Ja
maybe?
tutaj nie wymyślę prochu, ale chciałabym...
I'm not going to invent the dynamite,
Jak mówił o tym...
but this is how my father, Kazimierz Albin, talked about it.
Oczywiście ostatnie lata, jak już
His last years, as I said,
teraz podkreślić,
let me emphasize it again, he dedicated his last years to talk about his difficult experience. He traveled the world and he talked his stories.
Bo jemu zależało właśnie na tym i myślę,
And he had some goal
mnie osobiście, jeżeli mam tę
to
rzadką możliwość
accomplish.
o tym,
I have this rare opportunity to talk about it.
z jednej strony
On the one hand,
przekazać
I want to
straszne wydarzenia,
pass memory about those difficult moments so that they never repeat again. Unfortunately, as we know from the experience from the last 3 months even,
że wojna niestety jest naszym
that war
będzie. No tym niemniej
is so close and
w tym czasie, kiedy ojciec jeździł i opowiadał,
we can't do anything about it. So when my father was traveling and was meeting young people,
nigdy więcej, hasło nigdy więcej, żeby nigdy więcej.
he often repeated, never again, never again.
Ludziom zgotowali ten los i żeby ludzie
People should not
wiemy, że to też jak
do it again. However, it was his dream hasn't been fulfilled, but I hope that the grain he was sowing would grow with time,
nie wiem, żeby nas potrząsnęło nami,
and maybe would be shaken by this experience.
no naprawdę zabijanie siebie nawzajem,
Killing each other, torturing, damaging is something that cannot be accepted.
druga rzecz,
We need to remember that. And the second thing, which is also important
to jest właśnie to, żeby
here,
pokazać,
is to
że
show
nawet w najtrudniejszych,
that even in
ekstremalnych warunkach można zostać człowiekiem.
extreme situations you can remain a human being,
Że trzeba starać się nie poddać
that you shouldn't give up, which is difficult
jakieś chwile zwątpienia.
because you have your doubts, you have nervous breakdowns.
I zresztą też drugiego.
My first and second, the other father
Nawet w tych
also broke down. But even in those most extreme conditions, you can remain a human being,
o siebie i
taking care of yourself and of the loved ones,
do tego, żeby innym pomóc.
and try to help others.
Takich sytuacji też było mnóstwo, bo tylko wspomnę jeszcze.
There were many
tutaj, bo
situations like
ojciec
this.
pracował
My
w
father
kuchni pewnego czasu,
worked in a kitchen, in SS-man's kitchen, so he had access to food.
Jak to było ważne.
It was so important.
Prawda, jedzenie, głód, jaki był strasznym problemem.
Hunger was a huge problem, I don't have to say it. So he tried to support other prisoners.
Część tego jedzenia, że tak
So some food was stolen and passed to others.
w takich warunkach nawet
So in such conditions, in such extreme conditions where people perished,
rozmaity,
where people died, where people were killed, you can't preserve this lamp of humanity and pass it on and use it and do something more than save yourself.
No i po prostu, żeby jednak wyjść potem, bo to myślę, że każde tutaj doświadczenie z tych
And every experience
zapewne, prawda, jest takie, że ktoś wyszedł z godnością, z
is that
przekonaniem,
you remain, you preserve your dignity and you pass this life examination well,
Może sobie w lustro patrzeć.
and you can look in your face,
Mieć z tego powodu też
into your face and be satisfied, although the years were of many years of life were lost. So this is crucial. Never again, and to remain a human being. It's a huge challenge. Eleonora.
Będę się streszczać szybciutko. Tak.
I'll try to be quick.
Tak jak i mój tato,
just as my dad,
w spotkaniach z młodzieżą.
I take part
Jest to dla mnie
in meetings with young people, and it's incredible. It's amazing to meet them in person. I go to schools. I meet with them online. I talk about my dad.
O KL Auschwitz.
I talk about Auschwitz concentration camp, and I tell them, I repeat to them that he passed his life examination. Last year, I published the book Mistrz. I mentioned it before.
Również już czeka.
Another publication is waiting.
Biorę udział
I take part in different conferences, historical conferences.
W Oświęcimiu.
I came to Oświęcim.
Po prostu nastawiona bardzo na sposób przekazywania dogłębny, prawdziwy.
I want to talk about my father, Tadeusz Pietrzykowski, in a true way.
Żeby też nazwiska ich nie zostały
I mention other people so that their names are not forgotten.
Biorę udział,
I take part.
Relacje do IPN-u.
I passed the accounts to the Institute of National Remembrance and to the Museum of Rotmistrz Pilecki, and in some programs I talk broadly about Tadeusz Pietrzykowski, my father. These are memories to be remembered forever. And you can really talk to young people. They are wonderful. When I talk to young people who are to take maturity exams last April, they called me later and they said, Ella, we were writing about your father during the exams. So they referred to our online meeting in Ostruda.
Tak jak powtarzam, to jest coś niesamowitego.
This is really incredible.
Rodzinny jest bardzo ważny i trzeba się tego trzymać. Także
we have to pass it on. We have to pass on the family remembrance. All of us are saying that those stories should not be forgotten. This is the most precious thing that we can pass to young people. This is our history.
To jest nasz cel w życiu.
This is our goal in life.
Stało się to moim celem.
And also my goal. Thank you very much.
Pani ważną rzecz w sposób dogłębny i prawdziwy.
You said in a deep and true way. You cannot lie to young people. They will to see it.
Prawdziwie, czy szminkowanie trupa.
I trzeba im mówić prawdziwie o wszystkim.
You have to be true in what you say.
Jest bardzo duże. Czy to są 8 klasy?
They are very much interested.
Z taką młodzieżą, prawda?
I talk to teenagers and they are very interested.
Bardzo prosimy panią Małgorzatę.
Małgorzata?
Ja myślę, że tak trochę to powinniśmy wziąć przykład Żydów, którzy bardzo
we should take the example from Jews.
nie zapomniała.
They take care that the Jewish youngsters don't forget. I will not be original, but I would say that schools should be obliged to organize visiting Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum, trips to this museum.
Oczywiście w 8 klasach, ewentualnie
I'm thinking here about 8th graders or high schools.
na której zwiedzanie obozu nie zrobiłoby wrażenia.
I know that visiting this place makes impression on everybody and we should start with it. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję. To jest wyzwanie tutaj konkretne.
this is a challenge. It's also
tych organizatorów tych Auschwitz, tego muzeum i
it's a challenge for the museums
żeby to było rzeczywiście
managers, how to reach out to young people so that they can
Pani profesor,
live with it.
na zegarku i bardzo prosimy.
No więc ja chcę powiedzieć,
last but not least,
pani
lady.
powiedziała, jak byłam na chodzie jako nauczyciel,
When I was a teacher,
żeśmy organizowali
we always
wyjazdy
organized
do Auschwitz,
trips
ale
to
dla klas
Auschwitz.
dla maturalnych. Nawet
So
w konkursie brali udział. Uważam, że to jest dopiero
last graders came to Auschwitz
wcześniej to jest nie
because they should be mature to come here.
Myślę, że ponieważ w piątek przyjeżdża właśnie z
On
Niemiec
Friday, a group
10. klasy na
of teenagers comes to Katowice from Germany and we'll have a 3-hour presentation.
okazję, żeby do tej młodzieży trochę przemówić.
So we'll talk to those young people.
Że nie można.
Let me note.
Uczniowie mnie pytają w Niemczech, co czuć
So
wojnie jako
Germans asked me what I felt after the war. I felt hatred, and I wrote it in my diary
to się muszą zemścić.
that if I had
Dziecka, które przeżyło wojnę.
if I have sons, I would make them fight and revenge. But when you become mature, you can see that in every nation there's a group of people who are active, positive, negative, with negative attitude. So you cannot set any nationality borders. You can have make friends with Germans and so on and so forth.
No jak to ta Unia Europejska teraz stwarza warunki,
The European Union creates conditions that
przedostajemy
now
płynnie.
we don't have problems with crossing the border, so we should have a uniform community.
Można mieć swoje jakieś, ale do pewnych rzeczy powinniśmy mieć jednakowy stosunek. Przecież Niemcy też w
You
okresie
should have the same attitude to certain things.
Hitlerowi organizowali spiski.
Germans also were fighting against Hitler. There were some Germans in camps who had presented a humanistic approach. My aunt, who was pregnant in one Roko, she was sent to extermination, but the German didn't take her to crematorium, but he took her to Schreiber's office. There was a lady there, a Jewish lady, and he led her to this office, and she avoided death on that day. But several days later, he was ordered to approach barbed wire, and she was shot down. And one of the ladies from Zabrze wrote to me because she thought I was the daughter of her. And the death sentence was given to that Nazi who sentenced her to death, but this penalty wasn't executed. Thank you.
Thank you for this crowning element, this forgiveness.
To, co się pani profesor dokonało, przebaczenie. I to, co się wtedy rodziło, przez życie zostało
forgiveness and something that was born in there, processed through your life, and then need to talk about it to Germans as well. I wish to thank you very much. We've met the time limit, and I'm personally very grateful to you, because this is a very important lesson for me as well. Yet another step in trying to touch this reality, think about our today and our tomorrow, and the responsibility that we bear. Thank you very much. Excellent.
Chciałam bardzo podziękować.
Wish to
My też chcieliśmy bardzo tak. My też chcieliśmy bardzo podziękować
We would like to thank you,
częścią swojej osobistej historii.
speakers, for sharing your personal histories and clear references to the present times, something that's so important. And I wish to thank you all present here for participating in the conference. The conference is now drawn to the end.